From a pharaoh's broken skull in a tense Nile dawn to a king's quiet walk toward a cold Paris machine, this is a calm yet haunting journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 soothing hours. We'll begin with why SEQENENRE clustered head wounds still whisper of a war that remade Egypt, and move deeper into how a sharpened frame in revolution tried to turn a monarch into a message. So, put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. SEQENENRE. The morning mist clings to the Nile like a shroud, and in the distance, the great river moves as it always has, indifferent to the political storms brewing along its banks. This is Thebes in the late Hyksos period, somewhere around 1560 BCE, and tension hangs in the air thicker than the river fog. The city feels smaller somehow, diminished under foreign rule, its ancient temples casting long shadows that seem to whisper of better days. For over a century now, the Hyksos have held dominion over much of Egypt. These foreign rulers, with their horse-drawn chariots and bronze weapons, swept down from the Levant like a tide, establishing their capital at Avaris in the delta, and relegating the once mighty pharaohs to little more than vassals in their southern stronghold of Thebes. But vassalage, as any student of history knows, is rarely a stable arrangement. It breeds resentment like stagnant water breeds mosquitoes. Enter SEQENENRE, a man whose very name would become synonymous with resistance. He rules from Thebes as a subordinate pharaoh, paying tribute to his Hyksos overlords, while quietly nurturing dreams of restoration. The archaeological record suggests he was a capable administrator, maintaining the fiction of cooperation while slowly building the foundations for something far more ambitious. His wife, Queen Ahotep, stands beside him as both partner and political ally, and their young sons, future pharaohs Kamose and Ahmose, represent the next generation's hope for Egyptian independence. The catalyst for what would become Egypt's war of liberation comes, according to later sources, in the form of what can only be described as calculated political provocation. The story goes that Apophis, the Hyksos king ruling from Avaris hundreds of miles to the north, sent an extraordinary message to SEQENENRE. The complaint? The hippopotamuses in Thebes were apparently making too much noise and keeping the Hyksos ruler awake at night. Now, we must pause here and acknowledge the historiographic complexity of this tale. The hippopotamus letter appears in later Egyptian texts, particularly the Salia papyrus, written long after the events it describes. Modern historians debate whether this represents literal truth or symbolic storytelling, a way for later generations to encapsulate the petty humiliations and manufactured grievances that often precede major conflicts. The geographical impossibility of hearing hippos across such distances suggests we're dealing with something more sophisticated than a simple noise complaint. What the story really captures is the nature of imperial overreach, the way dominant powers often push their subordinates beyond the breaking point through seemingly trivial but deeply insulting demands. Whether the hippopotamus letter is historical fact or political allegory, it represents the moment when accommodation became impossible and rebellion inevitable. SEQENENRE's response to this provocation marked the beginning of what Egyptologists call the Wars of Liberation. But transforming resentment into effective military action required more than royal anger. The pharaoh faced severe constraints that any rebel leader would recognize. His resources were limited, his territory circumscribed, and his enemy possessed superior military technology. The Hyksos had introduced horse-drawn chariots to Egyptian warfare, along with composite bows and improved bronze weaponry. SEQENENRE's forces would be fighting at a significant technological disadvantage. Yet preparation began in earnest. Archaeological evidence suggests increased military activity in Thebes during this period: weapons manufacturing, fortification repairs, and the kind of logistical groundwork that serious campaigns require. SEQENENRE had to balance the delicate act of appearing loyal while secretly organizing rebellion, knowing that discovery would mean not just his own death but potentially the extermination of his entire family line. The domestic dimension of this political drama adds another layer of poignancy to the story. Queen Ahotep emerges from the records as a formidable figure in her own right, someone who understood that her husband's rebellion was as much about their children's future as Egypt's independence. Young princes Kamose and Ahmose were being prepared not just for kingship, but for a war that might well consume their father. What happened next can only be reconstructed from fragments, archaeological evidence, later textual sources, and the most dramatic piece of evidence of all, SEQENENRE's mummy, discovered in the late 19th century and now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The pharaoh's remains tell a story more vivid and terrible than any written account. The skull bears the unmistakable marks of violence, multiple traumatic injuries that speak to a brutal end. Forensic examination reveals wounds inflicted by different weapon types, an axe blow to the forehead, a crushing impact from a mace, and what appears to be a dagger thrust behind the left ear. These are not the random injuries of battlefield chaos, but the systematic violence of execution or ritual killing. The forensic evidence suggests several possible scenarios for SEQENENRE's death. He might have been captured in battle and executed by his enemies, the multiple wounds indicating either a ritualized killing or the work of several executioners. Alternatively, the clustered head injuries could represent battlefield trauma from close combat, followed by posthumous mutilation of his corpse, a practice not unknown in ancient warfare. What emerges most clearly from the physical evidence is that SEQENENRE's death was neither quick nor merciful. The wounds speak to prolonged violence, whether delivered in the heat of battle or the cold calculation of execution. For a man who dared challenge foreign domination, the end came with all the brutality that failed rebellion typically brings. Yet death, in this case, proved to be not an ending, but a beginning. SEQENENRE's sacrifice, for that is how later generations would remember it, became the foundational blood offering for Egyptian independence. His son Kamose immediately took up the banner of rebellion, continuing the war with even greater determination. When Kamose too died young, his brother Ahmose completed what their father had started, finally expelling the Hyksos and founding the new kingdom that would make Egypt an imperial power. The violent end of SEQENENRE Tau became woven into the mythic fabric of Egyptian nationalism. Later, pharaohs would invoke his memory as they launched their own campaigns, and the story of his resistance became a template for how true kings should respond to foreign domination. The brutal head wounds that ended his life were transformed into symbolic crowns of sacrifice. Archaeological method allows us to separate myth from evidence to some degree. The mummy examination provides hard data about the manner of death, while textual sources reveal how later generations chose to remember and reshape the story. Yet even scientific analysis cannot fully answer the question of what drove this ancient king to risk everything for the promise of liberation. Perhaps the most we can say is that SEQENENRE Tau understood something fundamental about the cost of freedom, that some transitions require blood, some changes demand sacrifice, and some futures can only be purchased with the currency of the present. His shattered skull speaks across the millennia to remind us that the price of defying power is often paid in the most personal and brutal terms, but that sometimes, just sometimes, that price proves to be an investment in tomorrow rather than a waste of today. Cyrus, the Great. Dawn breaks slowly over the vast steppes of Central Asia, painting the grasslands in shades of gold that seem to stretch beyond the edge of the world itself. Here, where the known world dissolves into legend and rumor, the greatest empire the ancient world had yet seen reaches its farthest extent. Persian scouts water their horses at streams whose names exist only in local dialects, while behind them, the administrative machinery of Cyrus's realm hums with the efficient brutality that has made one man master of everything from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush. Cyrus II of Persia. History knows him as Cyrus the Great. had achieved something unprecedented in human civilization. Unlike previous conquerors who simply replaced one ruling elite with another, he had created something genuinely new, a multi-ethnic imperial model that governed through adaptation rather than suppression. Babylonians served alongside Persians in his administration, former enemies commanded his armies, and local customs were preserved rather than destroyed. It was, by the standards of its time, a remarkably enlightened form of imperialism. But empires, even enlightened ones, possess an internal logic that drives them ever outward. Success breeds ambition, and ambition breeds the need for new victories to validate old ones. By 530 BCE, Cyrus had conquered the Lydians under Croesus, absorbed the Babylonian Empire, and brought the Greek cities of Ionia under Persian control. The only frontiers left were the dangerous ones, the places where civilization met the untamed world. The Eastern campaign that would ultimately cost Cyrus his life began, like many imperial ventures, with a mixture of strategic necessity and personal pride. The Massagetae, a nomadic confederation inhabiting the regions beyond the Oxus River, represented both a potential threat and an irresistible challenge. These were not settled peoples who could be incorporated into the Persian administrative system, but warriors who lived by raiding and warfare, recognizing no authority beyond their own tribal structures. For Cyrus, the strategic calculation seemed straightforward. Nomadic peoples on the empire's borders represented a permanent source of instability. They could neither be fully conquered nor safely ignored. A decisive victory would secure the eastern frontier and demonstrate that Persian power extended even into the legendary lands beyond the known world. For a ruler whose legitimacy rested on an unbroken string of conquests, the temptation to add one more victory, one final proof of divine favor, must have seemed irresistible. The most detailed account of what followed comes from Herodotus, writing more than a generation after the events he describes. According to his narrative, the Massagetae were ruled by Queen Tomyris, a figure who has fascinated historians and storytellers ever since. Herodotus presents her as both a capable military commander and a grieving mother, someone who understood the true cost of the imperial ambition that had reached her doorstep. The story, as Herodotus tells it, begins with Cyrus's attempt at diplomatic conquest. He sent marriage proposals to Tomyris, hoping to add the Massagetae to his empire through alliance rather than warfare. The queen, according to this account, saw through the stratagem immediately and rejected the offer with words that have echoed through history. "Rule your own people, and try to bear the sight of me ruling mine." When diplomacy failed, Cyrus resorted to deception. His forces pretended to retreat, leaving behind a camp stocked with wine and rich foods. The pursuing Massagetae, unfamiliar with alcohol's effects, fell into a trap that would have impressed Odysseus himself. Among the prisoners taken in this ambush was Spargapises, son of Queen Tomyris and heir to the Massagetae throne. The young prince's subsequent suicide in Persian captivity provided Tomyris with both personal motivation for revenge and a powerful symbol to rally her people. Her message to Cyrus, preserved in Herodotus's account, carries the weight of prophetic warning. Bloodthirsty Cyrus, do not be proud of what you have accomplished. If you will not take my advice and withdraw, I swear by the sun, the lord of the Massagetae, that for all your insatiable appetite, I will give you your fill of blood. The final battle, fought somewhere in the steppelands east of the Caspian Sea, represented a collision between two entirely different military systems. Persian imperial warfare relied on organization, logistics, and the coordinated use of different troop types, heavy infantry, cavalry, archers, and siege equipment working together in carefully planned campaigns. The Massagetae, by contrast, fought as their ancestors had for generations, mounted archers whose entire military culture was built around mobility, individual skill, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Herodotus describes the battle as one of the bloodiest of the ancient world, a grinding melee that lasted until the Massagetae finally gained the upper hand. In the chaos of defeat, Cyrus the Great, the man who had never lost a battle, who had toppled kingdoms and reshaped the political map of the known world, found himself among the Persian dead. What happened next forms one of the most striking revenge narratives in ancient literature. According to Herodotus, Queen Tomyris searched among the Persian corpses until she found Cyrus's body. In an act that was both personal vengeance and ritual statement, she filled a wineskin with human blood and thrust the dead king's head into it, declaring, "Though I am alive and have defeated you in battle, you have destroyed me by treacherously taking my son. But as I threatened, I will give you your fill of blood." Yet we must approach this dramatic account with the same critical eye that modern historians bring to all ancient sources. Herodotus, writing decades after the events, was working with oral traditions, Persian court histories, and his own narrative instincts, as much as with reliable testimony. Other ancient sources offer different versions of Cyrus's death. Some place it in different locations, others describe different circumstances entirely. What we can say with more confidence is that Cyrus died in campaign against the peoples of Central Asia, and that his death came as a shock to an empire that had grown accustomed to unbroken victory. The political implications were immediately apparent. Succession in the Persian system, while generally hereditary, required the new king to demonstrate his capability through military success and administrative competence. Cyrus's sudden death in a frontier war created exactly the kind of uncertainty that could tear apart a multi-ethnic empire. Yet the Persian system proved more resilient than its enemies hoped. Cambyses II, Cyrus's eldest son, managed the transition smoothly enough to maintain imperial unity while planning his own campaigns of conquest. The empire's administrative machinery, built to function even during the king's absence on campaign, continued to operate effectively. Provincial governors, or satraps, maintained order in their regions while acknowledging the new king's authority. The memory of Cyrus's death, however, took on a life of its own that extended far beyond Persian court politics. Later, Persian sources tended to downplay or ignore the more dramatic elements of Herodotus's account, preferring to remember their great king as dying in glorious battle rather than suffering posthumous humiliation. Greek writers, by contrast, found in Queen Tomyris's revenge a powerful symbol of barbarian justice triumphing over civilized tyranny. Modern historians and archaeologists have attempted to separate historical fact from literary invention, but the truth remains elusive. No contemporary Persian sources describe Cyrus's death in detail, and the archaeological record from Central Asian battlefields of this period is fragmentary at best. We are left with competing narratives, each shaped by the political and cultural perspectives of their authors. What emerges most clearly from the various accounts is the way frontier warfare generated its own mythic vocabulary. The civilized empire meeting its match in the wild borderlands, the great king brought low by barbarian cunning, the mother's vengeance transcending political calculation. These became recurring themes in how ancient peoples understood the limits of imperial power. The story of Cyrus and Queen Tomyris speaks to something deeper than mere historical curiosity. It captures the eternal tension between empire and freedom, between the organizing impulse of civilization and the fierce independence of peoples who refuse to be organized. In Herodotus's telling, at least, it represents one of history's earliest explorations of the idea that some forms of power carry within themselves the seeds of their own destruction. Whether Queen Tomyris actually filled a wineskin with blood and gave Cyrus the Great his prophesied fill of it, we will likely never know. But the story endures because it speaks to a fundamental human intuition about the price of ambition and the unpredictable nature of justice. Even the greatest conquerors, it suggests, remain mortal men who bleed the same red blood as their humblest subjects. Darius III, The dust of the Bactrian plateau rises in small whirlwinds that seem to mirror the confusion of the men who raise it, their footsteps marking a retreat that has stretched across half an empire. The royal retinue that once numbered in the thousands has dwindled to a few hundred desperate souls, their Persian court robes now travel-stained and threadbare, their faces bearing the particular hollowness that comes from watching a world collapse in slow motion. At their center rides Darius III, the last Achaemenid king, though that title grows more meaningless with each mile they put between themselves and the pursuing Macedonians. It is 330 BCE, and the Persian Empire, the greatest political structure the ancient world has yet produced, is dying the death of 1,000 cuts. The process began 4 years earlier when a young Macedonian king named Alexander crossed the Hellespont with 35,000 men and dreams of Asian conquest that seemed, at the time, like the fantasies of a madman. Now those fantasies have become the nightmare reality that haunts Darius's sleep and drives him ever further from the centers of Persian power. Darius had not sought this throne. Born Artashata, he was a distant cousin of the royal line who found himself elevated to kingship only after a series of palace intrigues and assassinations had cleared the succession of more obvious candidates. When he took the crown name Darius III in 336 BCE, he inherited an empire that was wealthy beyond measure, but riddled with the administrative corruption and military complacency that often characterize long-established powers. The early signs were ominous. Reports from the western satrapies spoke of unusual Macedonian military activity, but the Persian court, insulated by centuries of successful rule, initially dismissed Alexander as another ambitious Greek prince whose dreams would shatter against Persian reality. After all, hadn't Xerxes' grandfather Cyrus conquered the Greeks before? Hadn't generations of Persian kings maintained hegemony over the fractious city-states of Hellas through a combination of diplomacy and force? But Alexander proved to be something different, not just another Greek opportunist, but a military genius whose tactical innovations were matched by an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in his men. The Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE should have been a warning. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE should have been a wake-up call. Instead, each Persian defeat seemed only to deepen the imperial court's inability to grasp the magnitude of the threat they faced. Issus was where Darius first encountered Alexander personally, where the Persian king got his first taste of the humiliation that would define his remaining years. The battle began promisingly enough for Persian arms. Darius commanded a force that outnumbered Alexander's army by at least 2 to 1, and the coastal plain near modern-day Turkey seemed to offer the kind of terrain where Persian numbers could tell. But Alexander's tactical brilliance turned numerical advantage into confused chaos, and when the Macedonian cavalry broke through Persian lines, Darius faced a choice that would haunt him forever: stand and die with honor, or flee and live to fight another day. He chose flight, abandoning his chariot on the battlefield and escaping on horseback, while his army disintegrated behind him. Worse, he left behind his mother, wife, and children, who fell into Macedonian hands and became both hostages and symbols of Persian royal humiliation. Alexander's treatment of these captives, respectful but firm, only emphasized the complete reversal of fortune that had befallen the Persian royal house. The aftermath of Issus revealed the depth of Persian strategic confusion. Rather than recognizing the existential nature of the threat, Darius attempted to negotiate from weakness, offering Alexander territorial concessions and marriage alliances that might have satisfied a traditional conqueror but fell far short of Macedonian ambitions. Alexander's response, that he would take what he pleased rather than accept what was offered, should have clarified the situation, but Persian strategic thinking remained trapped in old patterns. Gaugamela in 331 BCE was Darius's last chance to reverse the tide of conquest through conventional military means. This time the Persian king chose his ground carefully, selecting a broad plain near modern-day Iraq, where his numerical superiority and the feared Persian cavalry could operate most effectively. The army he assembled was enormous, even by Persian standards. Contingents from across the empire, specialized troops with unique weapons and tactics, war, elephants, and scythed chariots that represented the accumulated military wisdom of generations. Yet the result was an even more complete disaster than Issus. Alexander's tactical innovations, the oblique order, the coordinated use of different troop types, the precise timing of his cavalry charge, turned Persian numbers into Persian chaos. When the Macedonian breakthrough came, it was so sudden and complete that Darius barely had time to flee before his entire center collapsed. This time, there would be no opportunity for negotiated settlement or strategic recovery. The flight eastward that followed Gaugamela marked the beginning of Darius's final chapter. With Alexander in control of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the great administrative and ceremonial centers of Persian power, the last Achaemenid king became a refugee in his own empire. The psychological effect on both Darius and his remaining followers was devastating. They were not just retreating, they were witnessing the dissolution of a political system that had seemed as permanent as the mountains. The journey into Bactria and Sogdiana was a masterclass in political decay. Each day brought fresh evidence of eroding authority as local satraps calculated whether their interests lay with a fugitive king or a victorious conqueror. Messages from Alexander, offering generous terms to any Persian noble who surrendered, found increasingly receptive audiences among men who had once sworn absolute loyalty to Darius's crown. The final conspiracy that would cost Darius his life emerged from this corrosive atmosphere of defeat and betrayal. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria and one of Darius's most trusted commanders, found himself in an impossible position. As a regional governor, he had legitimate authority in his own territories, but that authority was being steadily undermined by his association with a king who could no longer protect his followers or reward their loyalty. Bessus's calculation was brutally simple: better to be Alexander's ally than Darius's victim. But the transition from loyalty to treachery required a gesture dramatic enough to convince the Macedonian king of Persian sincerity. The murder of the last Achaemenid would serve that purpose, while simultaneously eliminating any possibility of future Persian restoration. The conspiracy that developed around Bessus included other high-ranking Persian nobles who had reached similar conclusions about their political survival. Nabazanes, the Chiliarch or chief minister, and Barsaintes, satrap of Arachosia, brought to the plot both their own forces and the implicit support of other Persian grandees, who saw no future in continued resistance. The actual assassination took place as the royal party struggled along the dusty roads of eastern Iran, their progress slowed by the kind of logistical difficulties that accumulate when central authority collapses. According to the sources, the conspirators first attempted to persuade Darius to abdicate voluntarily, perhaps hoping that a peaceful transfer of power might maximize their own chances with Alexander. When the king refused, they resorted to violence. The murder itself was swift and brutal. Darius was stabbed repeatedly. The ancient sources suggest multiple attackers struck simultaneously to spread responsibility for regicide among the conspirators. Then, in a gesture that mixed political calculation with genuine fear of their victim's lingering influence, they left the body beside the road and fled eastward, hoping to reach Alexander before news of their deed could complicate their reception. The discovery of Darius's corpse by Macedonian scouts represented one of those moments when individual tragedy intersects with historical inevitability. Alexander, arriving shortly after his men found the body, demonstrated the kind of political theater that had made him as formidable a propagandist as he was a general. He covered the corpse with his own cloak, ordered a royal funeral, and declared that the murderers would be hunted down and punished, a gesture that simultaneously honored his fallen enemy and established his own legitimacy as Darius's successor. The propaganda value of this performance was incalculable. By treating Darius with posthumous respect, Alexander positioned himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful heir to Persian imperial authority. The message to surviving Persian nobles was clear: serve me as you served him, and you will find honor and advancement. Continue resistance, and you will find the fate of traitors. Yet the ancient sources that preserve these events, primarily Arrian, Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus, must be read with careful attention to their own biases and limitations. All were writing long after the events they describe. All were working from sources that had their own political agendas, and all were influenced by the literary conventions of their time. The noble death, the honorable enemy, the theatrical gesture of respect. These were standard elements of ancient historical narrative. What emerges most clearly from the competing accounts is not the precise details of Darius's death, but the broader political dynamics that made his murder almost inevitable. The last Achaemenid had become a liability, not just to his enemies, but to his own followers. A symbol of defeated authority, whose continued existence complicated everyone's calculations about the future. The death of Darius III marked more than the end of one man's life. It represented the final collapse of a political system that had ruled much of the known world for more than 2 centuries. The Persian Empire had been built on the principle that the king's authority was absolute and divinely sanctioned, that loyalty to the crown transcended all other political considerations. When that authority proved unable to protect itself or its supporters, the entire ideological foundation of Persian rule crumbled. In the end, Darius III's tragedy was not just personal but systemic. He died not because he was particularly incompetent or cowardly, but because he represented a form of royal authority that could not adapt quickly enough to changing military and political realities. His murder by his own nobles reflected not their moral failing, but their rational calculation that loyalty had become a luxury they could no longer afford. The dust that rose from the Bactrian roads as his killers fled eastward settled eventually, but the questions raised by his death would echo through subsequent centuries. What is the nature of political loyalty when traditional authority collapses? How do individuals navigate the transition between one imperial system and another? At what point does pragmatic accommodation become inexcusable collaboration? These were the questions that Darius III could not answer in life, and that his death by betrayal would pose to every subsequent ruler who found themselves caught between the old world and the new. Emperor Valerian. The Roman camp stretches across the Syrian landscape like a temporary city, its neat rows of leather tents and methodical organization speaking to centuries of military expertise that have carried the eagles from Britain to the Euphrates. Yet today there is something different in the air, a tension that has nothing to do with the usual pre-battle nerves that grip even veteran legions. The soldiers moving between the tent lines carry themselves with the particular weariness of men who have been fighting too many wars on too many fronts for too many years, their equipment well maintained, but their faces bearing the hollow look of exhaustion that no amount of training can disguise. This is the Roman Empire in the middle of the 3rd century, and it is an empire under siege from every direction imaginable. The year is 260 CE, and Emperor Valerian, once Marcus Licinius Valerianus, a man who had risen through the traditional cursus honorum to claim the purple, finds himself confronting a crisis that would have tested even Augustus or Trajan. But unlike those legendary predecessors, Valerian faces not one overwhelming challenge, but a cascade of interconnected disasters that threaten to tear apart the very fabric of Roman civilization. The troubles had begun years earlier, emerging from the kind of systemic problems that accumulate when an empire grows too large for its administrative and military resources to manage effectively. The Antonine Plague, which modern historians believe may have been smallpox or perhaps measles, had swept through the Roman world with devastating effect, killing perhaps 10% of the population. and leaving entire regions economically devastated. Urban centers that had been the backbone of Roman prosperity found themselves struggling to maintain basic services, while rural areas saw agricultural production collapse as farmers died or fled. As if plague were not enough, the empire faced an unprecedented wave of usurpations and civil wars. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century had already seen more than 20 men claim imperial authority, their brief reigns ending typically in violent death as rival claimants emerged from the military ranks. Each civil war weakened the frontier defenses, creating opportunities for barbarian peoples to probe Roman weakness and test the limits of imperial power. Into this chaos stepped the rejuvenated Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty, a power that had replaced the old Parthian kingdom and brought to the eastern frontier a level of organizational sophistication and military capability that Rome had not faced in generations. Under Shapur I, the Persians had adopted Roman military innovations while maintaining their traditional strengths in cavalry warfare, creating a hybrid system that proved devastatingly effective against Roman armies trained to fight other Romans. Valerian's decision to personally lead a campaign against Shapur represented both military necessity and political calculation. The emperor understood that his legitimacy depended on military success, that only victory against Rome's enemies could restore confidence in imperial authority and provide the resources needed to address the empire's other crises. At the same time, he faced the practical reality that the Persian threat was too serious to delegate to subordinates, who might use military command as a springboard for their own imperial ambitions. The campaign that led to Edessa began with the kind of methodical preparation that had made Roman arms famous throughout the ancient world. Valerian assembled what may have been the largest Roman army to operate in the east since Trajan's campaigns, drawing legions from across the empire and supplementing them with auxiliary forces that represented the full diversity of Roman military organization. The logistical effort required to move and supply such a force across the difficult terrain of eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia was a testament to the administrative capabilities that Rome could still deploy when circumstances demanded. Yet for all its impressive scale, Valerian's army carried within itself the seeds of the disaster that would follow. Many of the legions had been weakened by plague and civil war, their ranks filled with hastily recruited replacements who lacked the training and experience of traditional Roman soldiers. The officer corps, traditionally the backbone of Roman military effectiveness, had been depleted by years of political purges and military casualties, leaving crucial positions filled by men whose loyalty was questionable and whose competence was unproven. The confrontation at Edessa, when it finally came, unfolded with the kind of tactical complexity that characterized warfare between sophisticated military systems. Shapur had learned from earlier Persian defeats against Roman armies, adapting his forces to exploit Roman weaknesses while minimizing Persian vulnerabilities. The battle itself was less a single engagement than a series of maneuvers and countermaneuvers that gradually drew the Roman army into an untenable position. What happened next represents one of the most shocking reversals in Roman military history. The details remain disputed. Our sources for 3rd century events are fragmentary and often contradictory, but the essential facts are clear enough. Valerian, the Roman emperor, the heir to Augustus and Trajan, found himself a prisoner of the Persian king. For the first time in Roman history, a reigning emperor had been captured alive by a foreign enemy. The immediate political implications were staggering. Roman constitutional theory had no mechanism for dealing with a captive emperor. The very concept was so alien to Roman thinking that it created an institutional crisis that reverberated throughout the empire. Valerian's son Gallienus, who had been ruling as co-emperor in the west, found himself in the impossible position of claiming authority while his father remained alive but powerless in Persian hands. Yet it is the competing narratives of Valerian's captivity that reveal the most about the political use of imperial humiliation. Persian sources, particularly the monumental reliefs carved at Naqsh-e-Rustam and other sites, present Shapur's victory as a cosmic triumph that demonstrated Persian superiority over Roman pretensions. These reliefs show the Persian king on horseback, while a Roman figure, identified by inscription as Valerian, kneels in submission at his feet. The visual language making clear the complete reversal of traditional power relationships. Roman and later Christian sources, by contrast, developed increasingly elaborate stories of Valerian's humiliation that served their own ideological purposes. Later accounts describe the emperor being used as a human footstool when Shapur mounted his horse, being forced to wear Persian dress, and ultimately being flayed alive and his skin stuffed and displayed as a trophy. These stories, while vivid, bear all the hallmarks of propagandistic embellishment, designed to emphasize either Persian cruelty or divine punishment for imperial persecution of Christians. Modern historians approach these competing narratives with appropriate skepticism. The Persian reliefs, while clearly propagandistic, at least represent contemporary evidence created by people who had direct knowledge of events. The later Roman and Christian accounts, while more detailed, were written by authors working from oral tradition and their own theological or political agendas, often decades or centuries after Valerian's death. What seems most likely is that Valerian spent his remaining years as an honored prisoner rather than a tortured victim. Persian royal practice typically involved treating captured enemies with a respect proportional to their former status, and keeping a Roman emperor alive and visible served Persian diplomatic purposes better than executing him would have. The elaborate humiliation stories probably represent later embellishments designed to satisfy Roman psychological needs for explanation of unprecedented defeat. The real humiliation lay not in any specific indignities Valerian may have suffered, but in the simple fact of his captivity itself. For Romans accustomed to thinking of their empire as divinely ordained, and their emperor as the earthly representative of Jupiter, the image of Valerian kneeling before a Persian king represented a cosmic reversal that challenged fundamental assumptions about Roman destiny and divine favor. The absence of the captive emperor created a vacuum in the Western Empire that his son Gallienus struggled to fill. Without the legitimacy that victory provides, Gallienus faced a cascade of usurpations and barbarian invasions that the weakened imperial government could barely contain. The Gallic Empire broke away under Postumus, Britain and Spain followed suit, and even traditionally loyal regions began to question whether central authority could provide the security and prosperity that justified imperial taxation. Meanwhile, in the east, Shapur I used his victory at Edessa to launch a series of campaigns that carried Persian arms deeper into Roman territory than they had penetrated in centuries. Syrian cities fell one after another, their populations killed or enslaved, their wealth flowing eastward to fund further Persian expansion. The Roman defensive system in Mesopotamia, built up over generations of frontier warfare, collapsed so completely that it would take decades to rebuild. The propaganda value of Valerian's captivity extended far beyond immediate military advantage. The Persian monumental reliefs served as permanent reminders of Roman humiliation, visible statements of Persian superiority that would influence diplomatic and military calculations for generations. Later, Persian kings would invoke Shapur's victory as justification for their own campaigns against Rome, while Roman emperors would feel compelled to attempt the reconquest of territories lost during Valerian's captivity. Yet perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of Valerian's capture was the way it accelerated the transformation of the Roman Empire itself. The crisis of the 3rd century, which Valerian's defeat deepened and prolonged, ultimately forced fundamental changes in imperial organization and ideology. The old republican facades were finally abandoned, replaced by the openly autocratic system that Diocletian would later codify. The symbolic power of an emperor's lost freedom proved more devastating than any military defeat could have been. Romans could accept battlefield losses. They had happened before, and would happen again. But the image of their emperor as a Persian captive challenged the entire mythic structure on which imperial authority rested. If the emperor could be reduced to kneeling before a foreign king, what did that say about Roman claims to universal dominion? In the end, Valerian's fate became a mirror in which Romans could see reflected all their empire's vulnerabilities and contradictions. The man who had sought to restore imperial prestige through Eastern conquest instead became a symbol of imperial humiliation, his captivity serving as a permanent reminder that even the greatest powers remain subject to the unpredictable reversals of fortune that govern all human affairs. The exact manner and timing of Valerian's death in Persian captivity remain unknown, lost in the competing narratives and propagandistic distortions that surrounded his fate. But his legacy was clear enough. He had become the emperor who demonstrated that Roman power, for all its apparent permanence, was as fragile and mortal as the men who wielded it. Caracalla. The Mesopotamian road stretches ahead like a pale scar across the dark landscape, its Roman engineering evident even in the pre-dawn gloom where shadows pool between carefully placed stones. The morning air carries the scent of dust and distant water, the Euphrates flowing somewhere beyond the low hills that rise on either side of the imperial procession. There is something almost peaceful about this moment, this brief interlude between the great cities of the empire, when even an emperor can move through his realm with something approaching anonymity. But peace, as any student of imperial history knows, is often the moment when violence chooses to strike. The year is 217 CE, and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, history knows him better by his nickname Caracalla, derived from the Gallic cloak he favored, rides toward what he believes will be another in the long series of military campaigns that have defined his 6-year reign. The emperor is 30 years old, in the prime of life by ancient standards, and his physical presence commands attention even among men accustomed to imperial authority. Tall and powerfully built, with the kind of restless energy that comes from a lifetime of military activity, he carries himself with the particular confidence of someone who has never lost a battle and sees no reason to expect that situation to change. Caracalla's reign had been marked from its beginning by a combination of military innovation and domestic brutality that would have impressed even Caligula or Nero. Upon succeeding his father Septimius Severus in 211 CE, one of his first acts had been the murder of his younger brother Geta, killed in their mother's arms during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting. The fratricide had sent shockwaves through the Roman political establishment, but Caracalla had consolidated power with characteristic efficiency, purging Geta's supporters and reshaping the imperial administration to reflect his own priorities. Those priorities centered overwhelmingly on military affairs and the expansion of Roman citizenship throughout the empire. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE, which granted Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, was perhaps the most significant piece of social legislation in Roman history. Yet even this apparently enlightened measure served primarily military purposes. More citizens meant more potential soldiers, and Caracalla's ambitions required manpower on an unprecedented scale. The emperor's military reforms had revolutionized Roman army organization and equipment. Soldiers' pay was increased significantly, their equipment standardized and improved, and their training intensified to meet the challenges of fighting on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The traditional distinction between legions and auxiliary forces was gradually eroded, replaced by a more flexible system that could adapt quickly to local conditions and enemy tactics. These innovations came at enormous financial cost, requiring tax increases that strained the empire's economic resources and created resentment among the wealthy classes who had traditionally supported imperial authority. Caracalla's response to such opposition was characteristically direct: confiscation of property, execution of prominent critics, and the systematic replacement of unreliable officials with men whose loyalty was based on fear rather than tradition. The journey that would prove fatal had begun as part of a larger strategic plan to secure the empire's eastern frontier against Persian resurgence. The Sassanid dynasty had replaced the old Parthian kingdom with a more centralized and militarily capable state that posed unprecedented challenges to Roman security. Caracalla's planned campaign was intended to address this threat through a combination of diplomatic manipulation and overwhelming force, using internal Persian political divisions to Roman advantage while preparing for the possibility of major warfare. The immediate destination was a local shrine dedicated to the moon god Sin, located near the ancient city of Carrhae, where Crassus had met his doom more than 2 centuries earlier. The choice of location was probably not coincidental. Caracalla was known for his interest in historical parallels and symbolic gestures, and visiting the site of a famous Roman defeat before launching his own eastern campaign would have appealed to his sense of dramatic irony. The imperial party that made this journey was smaller than usual for security reasons. Traveling through potentially hostile territory with a large retinue would have announced the emperor's presence to anyone with hostile intentions, while a modest group could move more quickly and attract less attention. The escort consisted primarily of Praetorian guards and German bodyguards, elite units whose loyalty was considered absolute and whose fighting capability was proven through years of frontier warfare. Yet it was precisely this reduction in imperial ceremony that created the opportunity for assassination. Among the small group accompanying Caracalla was Marcus Opellius Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect, whose administrative responsibilities had made him indispensable to imperial operations. Macrinus was a career administrator rather than a military commander, a lawyer from Mauritania who had risen through the imperial bureaucracy based on competence rather than birth or military achievement. The seeds of conspiracy lay in Caracalla's increasingly erratic behavior and the growing financial strain his military policies placed on the empire. Recent months had seen a series of arbitrary executions and confiscations that had created fear even among the emperor's closest associates. Macrinus, as Praetorian prefect, was in a position to observe these developments firsthand and to understand their implications for his own survival. The catalyst for assassination may have been a prophecy or astrological reading that allegedly predicted Macrinus would succeed Caracalla as emperor. Whether this prediction was genuine or manufactured for political purposes remains unclear, but its existence gave the conspiracy both urgency and justification. In an age when omens and portents were taken seriously by even the most rational men, prophecy could become a self-fulfilling mechanism for political change. The actual assassination took place during a routine stop along the road when Caracalla dismounted to relieve himself, a moment of vulnerability that would have been impossible to predict but was quickly exploited when it arose. The emperor's German bodyguards, normally a formidable barrier against attack, were necessarily at some distance during this private moment, creating a brief window of opportunity for someone with hostile intent. The killer was Justin Martialis, a centurion in the Praetorian Guard, whose motives appear to have been both personal and political. Recent events had seen him passed over for promotion to a senior centurionate position, a slight that would have rankled someone who had devoted his career to military service. More significantly, his brother had apparently been executed by Caracalla's order, creating the kind of personal grievance that could transform professional disappointment into deadly resolve. Martialis approached the emperor under the pretense of delivering an official message, a common enough occurrence that would have aroused no suspicion among the imperial guards. When Caracalla turned to receive the communication, the centurion struck with a sword thrust that proved immediately fatal. The attack was swift and efficient, the work of a professional soldier who understood anatomy and knew exactly where to aim for maximum effect. The immediate aftermath demonstrated the carefully planned nature of the conspiracy. Rather than attempting to flee or fight his way clear, Martialis allowed himself to be killed by Caracalla's German bodyguards, effectively eliminating the most obvious link between the assassination and its organizers. This sacrifice was probably prearranged, designed to provide Macrinus with plausible deniability, while ensuring that no inconvenient testimony could emerge during subsequent investigations. Macrinus moved quickly to consolidate power, demonstrating the kind of political acumen that had made him indispensable to Caracalla's administration. Within hours of the assassination, he had secured the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard through generous bonuses and convinced the legions in the area that he was the natural successor to imperial authority. The speed and efficiency of this transition suggests careful preparation and the existence of a broader conspiracy than the historical sources explicitly acknowledge. The new emperor's first challenge was managing the political narrative around his predecessor's death. Caracalla, despite his brutality, had been popular with the army due to his generous pay increases and his willingness to share the hardships of military life. Simply denouncing him as a tyrant would have alienated the very forces Macrinus needed to maintain power, while praising him too highly might invite uncomfortable questions about the circumstances of his death. The solution was to present the assassination as the work of a lone malcontent, motivated by personal grievance, rather than political conspiracy. Martialis was posthumously vilified as a disgruntled soldier whose brother had been justly executed for military crimes, a narrative that explained his actions without implicating higher-level officials. Caracalla was praised as a great military leader whose tragic death had robbed Rome of future victories, while Macrinus positioned himself as the reluctant heir to imperial responsibility. This narrative management proved largely successful in the short term, allowing Macrinus to maintain power for over a year before facing serious challenges to his authority. Yet the circumstances of Caracalla's death created long-term problems that would ultimately contribute to Macrinus's own downfall. The army's loyalty had been purchased rather than earned, creating a transactional relationship that could be disrupted by anyone offering better terms. The broader implications of the assassination extended far beyond immediate political concerns. Caracalla's death marked the end of the Severan dynasty's direct line, opening a period of civil war and political instability that would plague the empire for generations. The military reforms he had initiated would continue to influence Roman army organization, but without his driving personality to maintain them, they gradually evolved into something quite different from their original conception. Perhaps most significantly, the assassination demonstrated the vulnerability that lay at the heart of imperial authority. For all their apparent power, emperors remained mortal men who could be brought down by a single determined individual with access and opportunity. The elaborate security arrangements that surrounded imperial persons were ultimately inadequate against threats that emerged from within the system itself. The lonely road near Carrhae, where Caracalla met his end, became a symbol of the isolation that power imposes on those who wield it. Despite being surrounded by guards and attendants, the emperor had died alone, betrayed by men he had trusted with his life. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The man who had conquered enemies across the known world had been defeated by a subordinate seeking personal advancement. In the end, Caracalla's assassination reflected the fundamental tension between the personal and institutional aspects of imperial rule. As an individual, he had been remarkably successful, a capable military commander, an innovative administrator, and a leader who inspired loyalty among his soldiers. But as an institution, the emperorship he represented had created the very conditions that made his murder both possible and, from certain perspectives, necessary. The Mesopotamian sun that rose over his corpse illuminated not just the end of one man's life, but the beginning of a new phase in the long crisis that would ultimately transform the Roman Empire into something unrecognizable to the generation that had acclaimed Caracalla as their divine ruler. Commodus. The evening light filters through the high windows of the palace bathhouse, casting long shadows across marble floors that gleam with the particular luster that comes from generations of careful maintenance. Steam rises gently from the heated pools, creating an atmosphere of serenity that seems almost otherworldly in its contrast to the political tensions that have gripped Rome for months. This is the private retreat where emperors have traditionally found respite from the burdens of ruling the known world, a place where the weight of the purple can be set aside for a few precious hours of solitude and reflection. But tonight, solitude will prove to be a luxury that Commodus can no longer afford. The year is 192 CE, and the empire teeters on the edge of crisis, under the rule of a man whose 12-year reign has become synonymous with the corruption and excess that periodically threaten to destroy Roman civilization from within. What began as a promising succession, the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, inheriting power at the height of imperial prosperity, has devolved into a grotesque parody of imperial authority that has alienated virtually every significant political faction in the empire. Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus had ascended to power in 180 CE, with advantages that few rulers in history could claim. The empire he inherited was at peace, its frontiers secure, its treasury full, and its administrative machinery functioning with the efficiency that 2 centuries of imperial evolution had perfected. The Antonine dynasty had provided Rome with a succession of capable rulers whose collective achievements represented perhaps the high point of ancient civilization, and Commodus seemed positioned to continue this golden age indefinitely. Yet from the beginning, there were signs that the new emperor's temperament was fundamentally unsuited to the responsibilities he had inherited. Where his father had been studious and contemplative, Commodus was impulsive and hedonistic. Where Marcus Aurelius had seen imperial power as a burden to be borne for the common good, his son viewed it as an opportunity for personal gratification on an unprecedented scale. The transformation of Commodus from a conventional Roman aristocrat into something approaching a living god began gradually, almost imperceptibly, as small indulgences expanded into major obsessions. His fascination with gladiatorial combat, initially an amusing eccentricity, became an all-consuming passion that led him to participate personally in arena contests, wielding real weapons against opponents who were under strict instructions not to harm the imperial person. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The ruler of the civilized world had chosen to identify himself with the most brutal forms of popular entertainment. This gladiatorial obsession was accompanied by an increasingly elaborate program of self-deification that pushed the boundaries of what even Romans, accustomed to imperial cult worship, were willing to accept. Commodus began appearing in public dressed as Hercules, complete with lion skin and club, claiming divine descent and demanding worship as a living god. Statues throughout the empire were rededicated to show his face, replacing those of traditional deities, while official documents began referring to him not merely as emperor, but as a divine incarnation walking among mortals. The financial cost of these theatrical displays was staggering, but it paled beside the broader economic damage caused by Commodus's systematic neglect of imperial administration. The careful fiscal policies that had sustained the empire through the reigns of his predecessors were abandoned in favor of whatever funding mechanisms could support his increasingly expensive fantasies. Tax collection became predatory, while lucrative government positions were sold to the highest bidders, regardless of their qualifications. Meanwhile, the actual business of governing an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Sahara was increasingly delegated to freedmen and favorites, whose primary qualification was their willingness to facilitate the emperor's entertainment. Traditional senatorial families found themselves excluded from positions their ancestors had held for generations, replaced by men whose loyalty was based on shared corruption rather than inherited responsibility. The political consequences of this transformation were predictable, but nonetheless devastating. The Roman Senate, already marginalized under previous emperors, found itself reduced to a ceremonial body whose sessions were devoted primarily to voting ever more elaborate honors for a ruler they privately despised. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most reliable supporters, grew restive as their commander became increasingly unpredictable, and their own position became associated with a regime that was losing legitimacy daily. Provincial governors, required to send ever larger tribute payments to fund imperial extravagance, began to calculate whether their own interests might be better served by supporting alternative claimants to imperial authority. The army, though still loyal in principle to the concept of imperial rule, showed signs of strain as traditional discipline conflicted with the bizarre commands emanating from an emperor who seemed more interested in arena performance than military affairs. The conspiracy that would ultimately cost Commodus his life emerged from this toxic political environment, but its immediate catalyst was characteristically personal and petty. The emperor's growing paranoia, fed by years of surrounding himself with flatterers and informers, had begun to focus on those closest to him. Recent weeks had seen a series of executions and forced suicides among palace officials, creating an atmosphere of terror that made survival seem more important than loyalty. The key figures in the final conspiracy represented different aspects of the imperial establishment that Commodus had alienated through his behavior. Marcia, his concubine, and perhaps the person with the most intimate access to the emperor, had grown increasingly fearful that her own position was becoming untenable. As a Christian, a fact she had carefully concealed during the early years of their relationship, she was particularly vulnerable to the kind of religious persecution that had become one of Commodus's periodic obsessions. Eclectus, the imperial chamberlain responsible for managing the emperor's daily schedule and personal security, found himself in an impossible position as Commodus's demands became increasingly unreasonable and dangerous. His administrative responsibilities required him to maintain some semblance of normal imperial routine while accommodating behavior that grew more erratic with each passing month. The stress of managing these competing requirements had convinced him that change was necessary for his own survival. Quintus Aemilius Laetus, the Praetorian prefect, represented the military establishment's growing discomfort with an emperor whose public behavior was becoming an embarrassment to Roman arms. As the commander of the forces responsible for imperial security, he understood better than anyone how Commodus's eccentricities were undermining the respect and fear that had traditionally protected emperors from their enemies. The assassination plan that these three developed showed careful attention to both opportunity and plausible deniability. Initial attempts focused on poison, a method that would allow the emperor's death to be attributed to natural causes while avoiding the political complications that would follow from obvious murder. Marcia, with her intimate access to Commodus's food and drink, was the logical person to administer such a substance. The first poisoning attempt appeared initially successful. Commodus consumed wine that had been carefully prepared with what the conspirators believed was a lethal dose of toxin, and he quickly began showing symptoms of serious illness. For several hours, it seemed that the conspiracy had succeeded in eliminating the emperor without revealing their involvement. But whether through miscalculation of dosage, the intervention of natural immunity, or simple bad luck, Commodus survived the poisoning and began to recover. The partial success of the first attempt created a new and more dangerous situation for the conspirators. Commodus was now aware that someone close to him had tried to kill him, even if he didn't know exactly who or how. His survival meant that investigation was inevitable, and investigation would likely expose at least some of the conspiracy participants. The choice became stark: complete the assassination or face certain execution, as the emperor's paranoia focused on those with access to his private quarters. The decision to resort to direct physical violence represented both desperation and opportunity. Commodus's illness had left him weakened and vulnerable, while his suspicions had not yet crystallized into specific accusations against the actual conspirators. Moreover, The emperor's habit of spending long periods alone in the bathhouse created a window of opportunity for someone with legitimate access to imperial quarters. The actual murder was carried out by Narcissus, a professional athlete and wrestling partner who had been recruited to the conspiracy through promises of advancement and threats of exposure for past indiscretions. His physical strength and regular access to the emperor during athletic training made him an ideal instrument for the final phase of the assassination plan. The confrontation in the bathhouse was swift and decisive. Commodus, weakened by poison and caught completely off guard, was unable to mount effective resistance against a younger and stronger opponent who had the advantage of preparation and surprise. The strangulation that followed was efficient rather than dramatic, the work of someone who understood the mechanics of violence and wanted to complete his task with minimal risk to himself. The immediate aftermath of the assassination demonstrated the careful planning that had preceded it. Rather than allowing chaos to develop, the conspirators moved quickly to manage the political narrative and secure the succession. Pertinax, a respected senator and military commander, had apparently been selected in advance as the preferred replacement, and he was proclaimed emperor with a speed that suggested prior consultation and agreement. The new regime's first priority was establishing legitimacy while distancing itself from the excesses that had characterized Commodus's rule. The dead emperor was immediately condemned by the Senate in a damnatio memoriae that ordered the destruction of his statues and the erasure of his name from public monuments. His gladiatorial performances were denounced as violations of imperial dignity, while his claims to divine status were dismissed as evidence of mental instability. Yet, the very efficiency of this transition raised questions about the nature of the conspiracy that had produced it. The speed with which Pertinax assumed power and the thoroughness with which Commodus's memory was erased suggested planning that extended far beyond the small group of palace officials who had carried out the actual assassination. The Senate's immediate cooperation in condemning the dead emperor implied that knowledge of the conspiracy, if not active participation in it, had extended throughout the Roman political establishment. The posthumous reputation that emerged around Commodus reflected the particular horror that Romans felt when imperial authority was perverted for personal gratification. Unlike emperors who had been overthrown for political or military failures, Commodus was remembered primarily for his degradation of the imperial office itself. His gladiatorial performances and divine pretensions were seen not merely as personal eccentricities, but as violations of the fundamental compact between ruler and ruled that sustained the empire. The isolation that characterized Commodus's final years became a recurring theme in how later generations understood his reign and death. Despite being surrounded by courtiers and attendants, he had become increasingly cut off from the political realities that might have saved him. His transformation from conventional aristocrat to deified gladiator represented not just personal corruption, but a systematic failure of the institutions that were supposed to constrain imperial behavior. The bathhouse where he died became a symbol of the vulnerability that lay beneath imperial grandeur. For all their apparent power, emperors remained mortal men who could be brought down by those they trusted most. The private spaces where they sought refuge from public responsibilities could become traps when public responsibilities caught up with them in the form of private vengeance. In the end, Commodus's assassination reflected the eternal tension between personal desire and public duty that defined imperial rule. His death marked not just the end of one man's life, but the collapse of the Antonine system that had provided the empire with its most stable and prosperous period. The civil wars that followed would demonstrate that killing a bad emperor was far easier than finding a good replacement, and that the price of eliminating tyranny was often chaos that made tyranny seem preferable in retrospect. Cleopatra 0. The private chambers of the Ptolemaic palace hold an almost ethereal stillness. Sunlight streaming through tall windows to illuminate mosaics that have watched over Alexandria's rise to become the greatest city of the Mediterranean world. In the distance, barely audible through walls built to insulate royalty from the common concerns of their subjects, comes the sound of marching feet and shouted orders. The systematic advance of Roman forces through streets that have known only Egyptian rule for 3 centuries. The great library, the lighthouse, the tomb of Alexander himself, all now belong to a new master whose arrival marks not just political conquest, but the end of an entire civilization. This is August of 30 BCE, and the woman who sits in these chambers represents far more than simply another defeated monarch awaiting her fate. Cleopatra 7. Philopator is the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final heir to a dynasty that has ruled the richest kingdom in the ancient world since the time of Alexander's successors. More than that, she is the embodiment of Hellenistic culture itself, that remarkable fusion of Greek intellectual sophistication and Egyptian mystical authority that has dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for 3 centuries. The collapse that has brought Roman legions to Alexandria's gates began more than a decade earlier, not with military defeat but with political miscalculation on a scale that could only have emerged from the intoxicating combination of love and ambition. Cleopatra's alliance with Mark Antony had seemed, at the time, like the natural culmination of Egyptian diplomatic strategy, an alliance between the richest kingdom and the most powerful man in the Roman world that would secure Egyptian independence while extending Ptolemaic influence throughout the Ptolemaic East. But the Roman Republic that Antony represented was itself in the final stages of dissolution, torn apart by civil wars that had been raging intermittently since the time of Marius and Sulla. The triumvirate that had temporarily stabilized Roman politics after Caesar's assassination was always an unstable arrangement, held together by mutual necessity rather than shared vision. When it finally collapsed, as everyone knew it eventually must, the contest for supreme power would be decided not by senatorial debate but by military force. The Battle of Actium, in 31 BCE, had settled that contest with devastating finality. Octavian, the future Augustus, had demonstrated not only superior naval tactics, but the kind of strategic patience that wins civil wars. While Antony and Cleopatra brought larger forces to the confrontation, Octavian's fleet was better supplied, better coordinated, and led by men whose loyalty was based on shared Roman identity rather than personal devotion to a general who had become suspiciously foreign in his sympathies. The aftermath of Actium revealed the fragility of personal loyalty when faced with systematic defeat. Antony's forces, once among the finest in the Roman world, melted away as individual commanders calculated their own chances of survival under the new dispensation. Egyptian gold, which had funded the war effort, proved inadequate to maintain cohesion among men who increasingly saw their future in accommodation with the victor rather than continued resistance. Antony's suicide, following the false report of Cleopatra's death, had removed the last barrier between Octavian and the conquest of Egypt. Without her Roman ally, the queen found herself commanding a kingdom whose military forces were no match for Roman legions, whose political system had no experience of resisting foreign conquest, and whose own subjects were increasingly willing to accept any ruler who could restore stability and prosperity. Yet Cleopatra's final weeks were characterized not by despair, but by a remarkable display of the political intelligence that had made her one of the most formidable rulers of the ancient world. Even in defeat, she understood that her most valuable asset was not military resistance, which was hopeless, but the symbolic power she represented and the uses to which that power might be put in Octavian's emerging political system. The negotiations that preceded her death reveal a sophisticated understanding of Roman political psychology. Cleopatra knew that Octavian needed her alive, at least temporarily, for his own purposes. A conquered queen would be an invaluable propaganda asset during his upcoming triumph in Rome, visible proof of his victory over the exotic Eastern enemies who had threatened republican values. Her children, particularly Caesarion, whom she claimed was Julius Caesar's son, represented both hostages for her behavior and potential complications for Octavian's own dynastic plans. What she sought in return was survival for her dynasty in some form, perhaps a client kingdom that would preserve Ptolemaic rule under Roman protection, or at minimum the lives of her children and their eventual restoration to positions of honor within the Roman system. These were not unreasonable demands by the standards of Roman conquest, which often preferred accommodation to extermination when dealing with sophisticated enemies. But Octavian's political needs proved incompatible with Cleopatra's survival. The propaganda narrative he was constructing around his victory required not just her defeat, but her elimination. The Eastern queen who had corrupted good Roman men like Antony, who had threatened to move the capital of the world from Rome to Alexandria, who represented everything foreign and feminine and dangerous about un-Roman influences. This figure could not be allowed to survive as a potential rallying point for future opposition. The Queen's realization that negotiation had failed seems to have crystallized suddenly, perhaps triggered by some specific indication that her children's lives were not secure or that her own fate would involve more than ceremonial captivity. The decision to choose death over captivity represented not despair but calculation, one final exercise of the royal prerogative to control her own destiny and shape her own legacy. The means by which Cleopatra ended her life have become the subject of legend, historical investigation, and considerable scholarly debate. The traditional story, immortalized in countless literary and artistic works, involves an asp, the symbolic serpent of Egyptian royal authority, smuggled into her quarters in a basket of figs. The snake's bite would have provided a death that was both relatively quick and symbolically appropriate, transforming the queen's suicide into a kind of mystical return to the protective embrace of Egyptian divinity. Modern historians and toxicologists have questioned various aspects of this narrative. The logistics of concealing a venomous snake capable of delivering a fatal bite are more complex than popular accounts suggest, while the symptoms described in ancient sources don't precisely match what we know about asp venom. Alternative theories suggest combinations of plant toxins that were readily available in the sophisticated pharmacological culture of Ptolemaic Egypt and would have been more reliable in their effects. Yet the specific method matters less than the broader significance of Cleopatra's choice to control the manner of her death. By refusing to allow Octavian to parade her through Rome in chains, she denied him one of the most valuable trophies of his victory, while simultaneously transforming her defeat into a statement about the nature of royal dignity and the limits of foreign power over Egyptian sovereignty. The immediate aftermath of her suicide revealed the extent to which her death served Octavian's purposes despite his apparent desire to keep her alive. The story of the exotic Eastern queen who chose death rather than submission provided perfect material for the moral narrative that would justify his transformation of the Roman Republic into an empire. Cleopatra became the embodiment of foreign corruption from which Augustus had saved Rome, her dramatic suicide proof of the fundamental incompatibility between Roman virtue and Eastern decadence. This propaganda narrative, refined and repeated by generations of Roman historians and poets, shaped how European culture would remember Cleopatra for the next 2,000 years. She became the archetypal femme fatale, the dangerous foreign woman whose beauty and cunning had nearly destroyed the greatest men of her age. Her intelligence and political sophistication were either ignored or reinterpreted as forms of manipulation, while her genuine achievements as a ruler were minimized in favor of her romantic relationships with Roman leaders. The children she had tried to protect through negotiation became pawns in Octavian's dynastic calculations. Caesarion, whose claim to be Julius Caesar's son represented a potential threat to the new emperor's legitimacy, was quietly executed despite guarantees of safety. The younger children were taken to Rome, where they were raised as members of Octavian's household, honored captives, whose presence demonstrated both his clemency and his complete victory over their mother's legacy. The kingdom of Egypt, which had maintained its independence for 3 centuries after Alexander's death, was absorbed into the Roman Empire not as a traditional province, but as the personal property of the emperor. The administrative systems that the Ptolemies had perfected continued to function, but now they served to drain Egyptian wealth northward to fund Roman expansion rather than to support the brilliant cultural synthesis that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Yet Cleopatra's carefully orchestrated death achieved something that her life had been unable to accomplish. It transformed her from a defeated enemy into an eternal symbol. The Roman propaganda that sought to diminish her became, paradoxically, the vehicle for her immortality. Every retelling of her story, even those intended to condemn her, preserved the memory of her intelligence, her courage, and her refusal to accept defeat on terms other than her own. The private chamber where she died became a shrine to the possibility that individual agency could triumph over historical inevitability. In choosing death over captivity, Cleopatra demonstrated that even the most complete political defeat could not eliminate personal sovereignty over one's own fate. Her suicide was simultaneously an act of despair and defiance, the final gesture of a ruler who understood that sometimes the most powerful statement one can make is the decision to stop speaking altogether. The sun that set over Alexandria on the day of her death marked not just the end of one remarkable life, but the conclusion of the Hellenistic age itself. The cultural synthesis that had produced the greatest library of the ancient world, the most sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, the most cosmopolitan civilization yet seen in human history, all of this now belonged to Rome, to be preserved, transformed, or discarded according to Roman needs. But the woman who had embodied this civilization's highest achievements would be remembered not as its victim, but as its final representative, someone who had understood both the price of resistance and the cost of submission, and who had chosen to pay the former rather than accept the latter. In death, Cleopatra achieved what had eluded her in life, a form of victory that no Roman triumph could diminish and no imperial propaganda could completely control. Leonidas, I. The mountains of Thermopylae rise like ancient sentinels in the pre-dawn darkness, their peaks barely visible against a sky that shows the first pale hints of morning light. Between these heights runs the narrow coastal pass that has funneled armies and merchants between northern and southern Greece for countless generations, a geographic bottleneck where the ambitions of empires must squeeze through a space barely wide enough for a cart and horses. Today, this unremarkable stretch of road will become the most famous battlefield in Western civilization, and the men who wait here in the growing light understand that they are about to participate in something far greater than a mere military engagement. The year is 480 BCE, and the Persian Empire under Xerxes has reached the zenith of its power and ambition. From the Indus to the Aegean, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt, a single monarch rules over more human beings than any individual in history. The army that now approaches Thermopylae represents not just Persian military might, but the collected strength of dozens of subject peoples, a cosmopolitan force that speaks 100 languages and fights with 1,000 different weapons and techniques. Against this imperial juggernaut stands a Greek alliance so fragile and fractious that its very existence seems to contradict everything historians know about Greek political behavior. The city-states that have managed to overcome their traditional rivalries long enough to present a united front represent only a fraction of the Greek world, while many of their neighbors have already submitted to Persian authority or remain nervously neutral, waiting to see which way the tide of war will flow. At the center of this improbable resistance stands Leonidas I, king of Sparta, a man whose entire life has been shaped by the unique military culture that dominates his city-state. From the age of 7, he has been trained in the agoge system that strips away individual personality in favor of collective discipline, that teaches Spartan boys to value death in battle above life in dishonor. that creates warriors whose reputation for invincibility rests not on superior equipment or numbers, but on their absolute refusal to retreat under any circumstances. Yet, Leonidas is more than simply a product of Spartan military conditioning. As one of Sparta's two kings, he represents both the religious authority that connects his city to its divine protectors and the political leadership that guides its strategic decisions. His presence at Thermopylae is not merely that of a military commander, but of a sacred figure whose death or victory will be interpreted as a sign of divine favor or displeasure. The strategic situation that has brought Leonidas to this narrow pass reflects the broader challenges facing Greek resistance to Persian expansion. The Greek alliance, led by Sparta on land and Athens at sea, has chosen to make its stand at Thermopylae, not because the position offers any hope of ultimate victory, but because it represents the best available option for buying time, while the main Greek forces prepare for larger battles to come. The pass itself is barely 50 feet wide at its narrowest point, a geographic feature that negates the Persian advantage in numbers by forcing even the largest army to attack on a front so narrow that only a few hundred men can engage simultaneously. Greek heavy infantry, or hoplites, with their bronze armor and long spears, are ideally suited to this kind of fighting, where individual skill and unit cohesion matter more than numerical superiority. But everyone involved in the fighting understands that Thermopylae is ultimately a delaying action. The Persian army is simply too large to be stopped permanently by any force the Greeks can assemble, while Persian naval power threatens to outflank any land-based defensive position. The best the defenders can hope for is to inflict sufficient casualties and delay the Persian advance long enough for the main Greek forces to prepare more defensible positions further south. Leonidas's decision to dismiss most of the allied Greek forces as the Persian attack intensifies has generated historical controversy that continues to this day. Some sources suggest that he ordered the withdrawal to save lives when it became clear that the position could not be held indefinitely. Others argue that the withdrawal was politically motivated, designed to prevent non-Spartan forces from sharing in the glory of a last stand that would become the stuff of legend. What seems most likely is that Leonidas understood the propaganda value of sacrifice as well as its military limitations. A fighting retreat by a large Greek force would be remembered as a tactical withdrawal. The annihilation of a small band of elite warriors would become a symbol of Greek resistance that could inspire future generations. The 300 Spartans who remained with their king, along with several hundred Thespians and a handful of other allies, were not dying for any immediate strategic advantage, but for the longer-term goal of creating a myth powerful enough to sustain Greek resistance through the dark days ahead. The final phase of the battle began when Ephialtes, a local Greek, revealed to Xerxes the existence of a mountain path that would allow Persian forces to attack the Greek position from behind. This betrayal, for that is how Greeks remembered it, transformed a defensive position into a trap, but it also created the conditions for the heroic last stand that Leonidas may have been planning from the beginning. Rather than attempting to withdraw when the Persian flanking movement became apparent, Leonidas positioned his remaining forces to face attacks from both front and rear simultaneously. The fighting that followed was less a battle than a prolonged execution, as wave after wave of Persian attacks ground down the Greek defenders through sheer attrition. Yet the manner of their resistance, disciplined, coordinated, unbroken even in the face of certain death, achieved something that mere survival could not have accomplished. The death of Leonidas himself became the centerpiece of the larger narrative that would emerge from Thermopylae. According to later accounts, the Spartan king fought with particular ferocity in the final melee, his bronze armor marking him as a target for Persian archers and spearmen who understood the symbolic value of killing enemy royalty. When he finally fell, his body became the focus of fierce fighting as both sides recognized the importance of controlling this ultimate trophy. The contest for Leonidas's corpse reflected the broader cultural significance that both Greeks and Persians attached to the battle's outcome. For the Persians, possession of the Spartan king's body would provide tangible proof of their victory and divine favor, while demonstrating to other Greek cities the futility of resistance. For the surviving Greeks, preventing this desecration was worth the lives of men who had already accepted death as inevitable. The recovery of royal remains from ancient battlefields was always fraught with practical and symbolic complications. Bodies' armor made identification difficult, while the chaos of close combat often scattered remains across wide areas. The several hours of fighting that reportedly centered on Leonidas's fallen body suggests either that identification was certain enough to justify the effort, or that the symbolic importance of the struggle was independent of whether the specific corpse was actually that of the Spartan king. The broader propaganda consequences of Thermopylae extended far beyond immediate military considerations. The battle became a foundational narrative for Greek resistance, providing concrete evidence that Persian forces could be defeated and that Greek values were worth dying for. The story of 300 Spartans holding off 1,000,000 Persians, numbers that were certainly exaggerated, but that captured an essential truth about the nature of the conflict, spread throughout the Greek world with remarkable speed. Later commemorations of the battle, from Simonides' famous epitaph to the memorial monuments erected at the battlefield site, emphasized themes of duty, sacrifice, and patriotic devotion that would influence Western political thought for millennia. The Spartan response to Persian demands for surrender, "Come and take them," became a template for defiant resistance to overwhelming odds, while Leonidas himself was transformed from a local king into a universal symbol of leadership under impossible circumstances. Yet modern historians must approach these heroic narratives with appropriate skepticism about their relationship to historical reality. The sources for Thermopylae were written by Greeks, often generations after the events they describe, and they served political and cultural purposes that sometimes conflicted with strict accuracy. The numbers involved, the specific details of combat, and even the precise motivations of key participants remain subjects of scholarly debate. What emerges most clearly from the competing accounts is the way battlefield death was transformed into civic virtue through the processes of commemoration and retelling. Leonidas and his 300 became more valuable to Greek resistance dead than they could ever have been alive, their sacrifice providing both inspiration for continued fighting and justification for the enormous costs that resistance would ultimately require. The psychological impact of Thermopylae on subsequent Greek military performance was profound and immediate. At Plataea the following year, Greek forces fought with a confidence and determination that drew explicitly on the memory of Spartan sacrifice. The battle cry, "Remember Thermopylae," became a standard element of Greek military culture, while the story of the 300 provided a template for heroic behavior that influenced Greek warrior culture for centuries. The long-term influence of the Thermopylae narrative extended far beyond ancient Greece. Roman historians and poets found in Leonidas's last stand a model for the kind of virtuous sacrifice that republican ideology demanded from its citizens. Medieval chroniclers saw parallels between Spartan resistance to Persian tyranny and Christian resistance to Muslim expansion. Modern democratic movements have consistently invoked Thermopylae as an example of free peoples defending their liberty against foreign oppression. Yet, perhaps the most significant aspect of Leonidas's death was the way it demonstrated the power of voluntary sacrifice to transcend immediate military consequences. The 300 Spartans achieved nothing tactically. Xerxes continued his advance, burned Athens, and came close to conquering all of Greece. But their willingness to die for principles larger than personal survival created a moral framework that ultimately proved more powerful than Persian arms. The mountain pass where Leonidas fell became a shrine to the possibility that individual courage could alter the course of history. The inscription allegedly placed over the Spartan graves, "Stranger, tell the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their commands." captured something essential about the relationship between personal duty and collective memory that continues to resonate across cultural boundaries. In death, Leonidas achieved a form of victory that no amount of tactical brilliance could have provided. His sacrifice became the foundation stone for a Greek identity that would ultimately defeat Persian expansion, create the philosophical and political traditions that shaped Western civilization, and demonstrate that sometimes the most important battles are won, not by those who survive them, but by those who understand what they are dying for. The sun that rose over Thermopylae on the morning after the last Greek defender had fallen illuminated not just a Persian victory, but the birth of a legend that would outlive the empire that had created it. Mary, Queen of Scots. The great hall at Fotheringhay Castle bears the weight of an English February morning, grey light filtering through tall windows to illuminate a scene that represents the convergence of 2 decades of political calculation, religious conflict, and personal animosity. The very air seems heavy with the gravity of what is about to unfold, not merely the execution of a convicted traitor, but the deliberate killing of an anointed queen by her fellow sovereign, an act so unprecedented in the annals of European monarchy that even its perpetrators seem uncertain about the precedents they are establishing. This is February 8, 1587, and the woman who will die here today embodies contradictions that have made her both irresistible and impossible for nearly half a century. Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots, represents simultaneously the romantic idealization of queenship and its most dangerous political realities. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly convinced of her divine right to rule, she has spent her adult life navigating the treacherous intersection of dynastic politics, religious warfare, and gender expectations that defined 16th century European power. The path that has led Mary to this scaffold began not with any specific crime, but with the fundamental impossibility of her position in a world where religious loyalty and political allegiance had become indistinguishable. As the legitimate heir to the Scottish throne and a potential claimant to the English succession, she represented an existential threat to the Protestant settlement that Elizabeth I had spent nearly 30 years establishing and defending. Mary's early life had been shaped by the broader European struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers, a conflict that turned even childhood into a form of political theatre. Crowned Queen of Scotland when she was 6 days old, she had been sent to France for her education and safety, growing up in the sophisticated court of Henri II, where she absorbed both the cultural refinements of Renaissance monarchy and the uncompromising Catholicism that would define her adult political identity. Her marriage to the Dauphin Francis, which briefly made her Queen of France as well as Scotland, had raised the terrifying possibility from an English Protestant perspective that Scotland, France, and potentially England itself might be united under Catholic rule. When Francis died young and Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, she brought with her not only personal grief but political ambitions that no amount of diplomatic accommodation could fully resolve. The 18 years of captivity that preceded her execution had been characterized by a complex dance of negotiation, conspiracy, and surveillance that revealed both Elizabeth's political sophistication and the inherent instability of housing a rival claimant within one's own borders. Mary's presence in England created a permanent crisis of legitimacy, too dangerous to release, too valuable to execute, too royal to treat as a common prisoner. The immediate legal pretext for Mary's trial and execution emerged from her alleged involvement in the Babington Plot, a Catholic conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the English throne with Spanish support. The evidence against her, consisting primarily of intercepted letters that may or may not have been genuine, reflected the sophisticated intelligence network that Elizabeth's government had developed to monitor threats to Protestant rule. Yet the trial that condemned Mary was less a judicial proceeding than a political performance, designed to provide legal cover for a decision that had already been made on strategic grounds. The commissioners who heard the evidence understood that they were not determining guilt or innocence in any conventional sense, but rather providing the formal justification that English law required for the execution of a foreign sovereign. Elizabeth's own role in these proceedings revealed the psychological complexity of a decision that violated fundamental assumptions about the nature of royal authority. The warrant that authorized Mary's execution was signed, withdrawn, resigned, and finally implemented through a process that suggested profound ambivalence about the precedent being established. Even absolute monarchs, it seemed, recognized the danger of too explicitly acknowledging their power over the lives of their fellow sovereigns. The elaborate ceremonial arrangements for the execution reflected both English determination to demonstrate the legitimacy of their proceedings and their awareness that they were venturing into unprecedented territory. The scaffold erected in Fotheringay's Great Hall was designed to accommodate not only the practical requirements of public execution, but the symbolic needs of a ritual that would be scrutinized throughout Catholic Europe for evidence of English barbarism or Protestant righteousness. Mary's own preparations for death demonstrated the political sophistication that had made her such a formidable opponent throughout her captivity. Her choice of clothing, red, the Catholic color of martyrdom, sent a clear message about how she wanted her death to be interpreted. Her behavior during the final religious ceremonies, conducted according to Catholic rites despite Protestant objections, established the framework within which sympathetic observers would understand her execution. The crowd that gathered to witness the execution represented a cross-section of English political society, from high-ranking nobles whose presence emphasized the government's commitment to the proceedings, to local gentry whose attendance demonstrated broader Protestant support for eliminating the Catholic threat. Yet the atmosphere was reportedly somber rather than celebratory, suggesting that even Mary's enemies understood the gravity of what they were witnessing. The technical aspects of the execution itself revealed both the practical difficulties of public beheading and the broader anxieties that surrounded the killing of royal persons. The executioner's initial blow failed to sever Mary's head completely, requiring a second stroke that completed the decapitation, but also emphasized the brutal physical reality underlying political abstractions about treason and sovereignty. The immediate aftermath of the execution was marked by incidents that would fuel Catholic martyrdom narratives for generations. Mary's wig reportedly came off during the beheading, revealing the grey hair of a woman prematurely aged by captivity and stress. More dramatically, her small dog, which had hidden beneath her skirts throughout the proceedings, was discovered covered in blood and refusing to leave its mistress's body. A detail that provided perfect material for those who wanted to emphasize the pathos of royal suffering. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of the execution's immediate aftermath was the systematic effort to control and manage the physical remains that might become objects of Catholic veneration. Mary's body was not immediately buried, but was instead held under careful guard to prevent the kind of relic gathering that had characterized other politically significant deaths. When burial finally occurred, it was in Protestant rites that denied Catholic interpretations of her martyrdom. The international reaction to Mary's execution demonstrated both the success and the limitations of Elizabeth's political strategy. Catholic Europe, led by Spain and the papacy, responded with predictable outrage and calls for revenge, but the practical consequences were less severe than English Protestants had feared. The execution provided additional justification for Philip II's planned invasion of England. But the Spanish Armada that sailed the following year was defeated by a combination of English naval tactics and providential weather. More subtly, the execution established precedents that would influence European political development for centuries. The idea that sovereigns could be held legally accountable for treason against neighboring states challenged fundamental assumptions about royal immunity and divine right. While this principle would not be fully developed until the era of modern international law, Mary's execution provided an early example of how political necessity could override traditional diplomatic immunity. The long-term memory of Mary's death was shaped by competing narratives that reflected the broader religious and political divisions of early modern Europe. Catholic sources emphasized her dignity in death, her commitment to her faith, and the injustice of her treatment by heretical usurpers. Protestant accounts stressed her guilt, the necessity of her execution for English security, and the proper subordination of papal loyalty to lawful authority. The physical setting of her execution became itself a subject of historical controversy and romantic elaboration. Fotheringhay Castle, already associated with royal tragedy through its connection to Richard III, gained additional significance as the site where the old order of European monarchy had been irreversibly altered. The Great Hall where Mary died became a pilgrimage site for Catholic sympathizers and a symbol of Protestant determination for Elizabeth's supporters. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of Mary's execution was the way it demonstrated the fundamental incompatibility between personal charm and political necessity in the world of 16th-century statecraft. Mary had been, by all contemporary accounts, remarkably attractive and personally compelling, qualities that had served her well in the intimate politics of Renaissance courts. But these same qualities, which made her an effective political actor, also made her too dangerous to live when religious warfare transformed personal loyalty into existential threat. The dog that refused to leave its mistress's body became, in subsequent retellings, a symbol of the natural loyalty that transcended human political calculations. Unlike the nobles and courtiers whose allegiances shifted with changing circumstances, the small animal demonstrated a fidelity that suggested something irreducible about Mary's personal magnetism, something that survived even the brutal reduction of royal majesty to bloody corpse. In death, Mary achieved a form of victory that had eluded her in life. The execution that was designed to eliminate her threat to Protestant England instead transformed her into a permanent symbol of Catholic resistance and royal dignity under impossible circumstances. The woman who had failed to maintain effective rule over Scotland became, through the manner of her death, a more powerful political force than she had ever been while alive. The grey light that filled Fotheringhay's Great Hall on the morning of her execution illuminated not just the end of one extraordinary life, but the beginning of a new chapter in the long history of political martyrdom. The precedent established by Mary's death, that sovereigns could be held accountable for their actions even by foreign powers, would resonate through the coming centuries of European political development, while the image of her dignity in death would inspire generations of Catholics who saw in her execution proof that earthly power was ultimately subordinate to divine justice. The blood that soaked the scaffold at Fotheringhay carried within it the beginning of the end for the old world of divine right monarchy. Though none of the participants could have understood the full implications of what they were witnessing, they had come to see the death of a queen. They had instead witnessed the birth of a new form of political accountability that would ultimately transform the nature of royal authority throughout Europe. Richard II. The stone walls of Pontefract Castle seemed to exhale centuries of accumulated dampness, their ancient blocks weeping moisture that speaks to the fortress's position in the marshy lowlands of Yorkshire, where winter fog clings to the ground like a living thing. In the dim light that filters through narrow windows, designed more for defense than comfort, the chamber that serves as both royal apartment and prison cell represents the nadir of fortunes that began with divine coronation and have descended through political miscalculation to this final, ignoble captivity. This is the winter of 1400, and the man who sits in these quarters bears a title that has become increasingly meaningless with each passing day. Richard II, by the grace of God, King of England and France, and Lord of Ireland, commands nothing beyond these damp walls, rules over no subjects, save the guards who bring his meals and monitor his movements. The crown that once sat upon his head with all the weight of divine sanction now rests on the brow of his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who has transformed himself from exiled duke to Henry IV through a combination of political opportunism and military efficiency that Richard must surely admire even as it destroys him. The deposition that brought Richard to this place represents one of the most significant constitutional crises in English medieval history, a moment when the theoretical foundations of royal authority collided with the practical realities of political power in ways that would influence English governance for centuries. The king, who had once declared that the laws of England lay in his mouth, found himself subjected to a legal process that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of monarchy itself. Richard's reign had begun with promise that seemed to justify the most optimistic predictions about divine kingship. Crowned at the age of 10, following the death of his grandfather Edward III, he had inherited not only the throne, but the accumulated prestige of English victories in France that had made his kingdom the dominant military power in Western Europe. The boy king, who received homage from his nobles in Westminster Abbey, seemed destined to continue the glorious tradition of the Plantagenet dynasty. Yet, from the beginning, there were signs that Richard's temperament was fundamentally unsuited to the collaborative style of governance that medieval kingship required. Where successful medieval monarchs understood the need to balance royal authority against the legitimate interests of their nobility, Richard showed an early inclination toward the kind of personal rule that treated opposition as treason and compromise as weakness. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which erupted when Richard was just 14, provided an early demonstration of both his political courage and his dangerous tendency toward absolutist thinking. His personal intervention in negotiations with the rebels showed remarkable bravery for an adolescent monarch, but his subsequent revocation of all concessions made during the crisis established a pattern of behavior that would characterize his entire reign. As Richard matured into adulthood, his conception of royal authority became increasingly influenced by continental models of kingship that emphasized the divine nature of royal power in ways that were foreign to English political tradition. The court culture he fostered drew heavily on French precedents, creating an atmosphere of ceremony and artistic sophistication that impressed foreign visitors but alienated English nobles accustomed to more direct access to royal authority. The political crisis that would ultimately cost Richard his throne emerged from his systematic effort to establish royal control over the traditional mechanisms of noble consultation and consent. His use of blank charters to extract unlimited financial obligations from his subjects, his creation of a private army loyal to his person rather than the crown, and his apparent willingness to rule through intimidation rather than consensus, challenged the fundamental compact between king and nobility that sustained medieval governance. The trigger for open rebellion came with Richard's decision to extend the exile of Henry Bolingbroke and confiscate the Lancastrian inheritance upon the death of John of Gaunt. This act violated property rights that the nobility considered fundamental to their own security, while the arbitrary nature of the decision suggested that no noble estate was safe from royal predation. When Bolingbroke returned from exile to claim his inheritance, he found a kingdom where fear of the king had overcome loyalty to the crown. The deposition process that followed Bolingbroke's successful invasion represented an unprecedented attempt to provide legal justification for what was essentially a military coup. The Parliament that assembled at Westminster in September 1399 faced the novel challenge of removing a king who was neither dead nor obviously insane, the only traditional grounds for royal replacement that medieval constitutional theory recognized. The charges against Richard, read aloud in Westminster Hall before an assembly that included representatives from throughout the kingdom, provided a comprehensive indictment of personal rule that would influence English political thought for generations. The king was accused of breaking his coronation oath, ruling through favoritism rather than law, and placing his own will above the common good of the realm. More fundamentally, he was charged with the novel crime of being insufficient and useless for royal government. Richard's response to these proceedings revealed both the dignity that had characterized the best aspects of his kingship and the political naivety that had made his downfall inevitable. His formal abdication, delivered in the Tower of London before a small group of commissioners, attempted to maintain the fiction that he was voluntarily relinquishing power rather than being forcibly removed. The elaborate ceremony surrounding his renunciation of the crown suggested his continued belief that royal authority possessed a sacred character that could be transferred but not simply seized. Yet even as Richard performed the rituals of abdication, both he and his successors understood that the constitutional crisis they had created could not be definitively resolved through legal procedures. A deposed king, even one who had formally renounced his title, remained a potential focal point for opposition to the new regime. As long as Richard lived, Henry IV's legitimacy would be vulnerable to challenge by anyone who questioned the legality of the deposition process. The circumstances of Richard's captivity at Pontefract reflected this fundamental problem. He could not be treated as a common prisoner without diminishing the dignity of kingship itself. Yet he could not be allowed the freedom that his royal status would normally require. The solution was a form of house arrest that preserved the forms of royal respect while ensuring complete isolation from potential supporters. The exact manner of Richard's death remains one of the most debated questions in English medieval history. Contemporary sources, written by men who served the new Lancastrian regime, naturally emphasized the ex-king's willing acceptance of his fate and his peaceful death from natural causes. Yet the timing of his demise, occurring just as serious rebellions threatened Henry IV's new government, suggests a level of political convenience that strains credibility. The most persistent narrative involves deliberate starvation, a method of execution that would leave few obvious traces while allowing plausible deniability about the cause of death. Medieval chronicle sources describe Richard refusing food in a fit of despair, but modern historians have questioned whether such a psychological collapse was consistent with the ex-king's behavior during his captivity. Alternative theories suggest more direct forms of violence, carefully concealed to avoid the political complications that would arise from obvious regicide. What seems most likely is that Richard's death resulted from a calculated decision by Henry IV's government that the ex-king had become too dangerous to remain alive. The rebellions that erupted in early 1400, aimed at restoring Richard to the throne, demonstrated that deposition alone could not eliminate the threat he represented. From a purely practical standpoint, the execution of the deposed king was a logical response to an impossible political situation. The immediate aftermath of Richard's death revealed the care with which the new regime had prepared to manage the political consequences. His body was displayed publicly in London to quell rumors that he remained alive, while his funeral was conducted with sufficient ceremony to demonstrate respect for his royal status, without creating opportunities for opposition demonstrations. The speed with which these arrangements were implemented suggests advanced planning rather than improvised response to unexpected death. Henry IV's public response to Richard's demise struck a careful balance between expressions of grief and assertions of political necessity. The new king acknowledged Richard's royal dignity, while emphasizing the divine judgment that had apparently validated the change of dynasty. This narrative framework allowed the Lancastrian regime to benefit from Richard's elimination while avoiding direct responsibility for regicide. Yet the constitutional implications of Richard's deposition and death extended far beyond immediate political convenience. The precedent established in 1399 that kings could be held accountable for their performance in office and removed when found wanting fundamentally altered the nature of English royal authority. Future monarchs would be forced to acknowledge, however tacitly, that their legitimacy depended ultimately on the consent of their subjects rather than divine appointment alone. The transformation of Richard's memory through subsequent literary treatment particularly in Shakespeare's great history play, reflects the enduring fascination with a figure who embodied both the attractions and the dangers of absolute royal authority. The Richard of Shakespeare's imagination, introspective, poetic, politically naive but personally compelling, captured something essential about the contradiction between the man and the institution he represented. The damp walls of Pontefract that witnessed Richard's final days became a symbol of the vulnerability that lay beneath royal grandeur. Even kings who claimed divine sanction for their authority remained mortal men, subject to the political consequences of their actions. The ex-king who died in these chambers had learned too late that royal power, however absolute in theory, was ultimately dependent on the practical consent of those it sought to govern. The manner of Richard's death, whether through starvation, violence, or despair, mattered less than its political significance, as the elimination of an alternative to the new Lancastrian dynasty. In choosing to remove a deposed king rather than risk his restoration, Henry IV's government established a precedent that would influence English political development for centuries. The idea that royal authority was conditional rather than absolute, that kings who failed in their duties could be legitimately replaced, became embedded in English constitutional thinking in ways that would ultimately lead to the more dramatic confrontations of the 17th century. The winter fog that shrouded Pontefract Castle during Richard's final captivity seemed to mirror the moral ambiguity that surrounded his fate. The man who had once claimed that the laws of England resided in his mouth had become subject to a form of justice that operated outside any recognizable legal framework. His death marked not just the end of one king's life, but the beginning of a new understanding of royal accountability that would reshape the relationship between English monarchs and their subjects for generations to come. King Henry VI. The Tower of London settles into its nocturnal rhythm with the particular stillness that comes when ancient stones have absorbed so much human drama that they seem to hold their breath in anticipation of whatever tragedy the darkness might bring. The White Tower rises against the night sky like a monument to the permanence of royal power, yet within its walls tonight dwells a king whose very presence demonstrates the fragility of the institution he represents. The year is 1471, and the wheel of fortune that has dominated English politics for more than a decade is about to complete another of its devastating revolutions. Henry VI sits in chambers that have housed both kings and prisoners, often simultaneously, their dual nature reflecting the ambiguous status of a monarch whose reign has been interrupted not once, but twice, by the violent assertions of rival claimants. At 49, he appears older than his years, worn down by the accumulated stress of ruling a kingdom that seems constitutionally incapable of accepting his authority. The gentle, scholarly temperament that makes him personally appealing has proven catastrophically unsuited to the brutal realities of 15th century English politics. The Wars of the Roses, which have torn England apart for the better part of 2 decades, represent more than simple dynastic competition between the houses of Lancaster and York. They reflect fundamental questions about the nature of royal legitimacy in an age when traditional sources of authority, divine sanction, hereditary right, military victory, have become contradictory rather than complementary. Henry's tragedy is that he represents the collision between medieval ideals of Christian kingship and the harsh pragmatism that political survival requires. Henry's reign had begun with promise that seemed to validate the most optimistic theories about divinely appointed monarchy. Inheriting the throne as an infant following the death of his warrior father Henry V, he had been surrounded by regents and advisors whose successful management of the kingdom during his minority suggested that good government was compatible with royal youth and inexperience. The England of his early years was still basking in the reflected glory of Agincourt, still confident that English arms could maintain the dual monarchy in France that Henry V had established through military conquest. Yet the very success of Henry V's reign created expectations that his son could never fulfill. The warrior king, who had conquered much of northern France and married into the French royal family, had established a standard of martial achievement that few monarchs could match. Henry VI's temperament, shaped by an education that emphasized Christian piety over military prowess, was fundamentally incompatible with the aggressive leadership that English nobles expected from their king. The loss of the French territories that his father had conquered marked the beginning of Henry's political troubles, but it was hardly the cause of his ultimate downfall. Medieval kings were expected to lose battles occasionally. Even the greatest warriors suffered reversals that could be attributed to divine will or enemy cunning. What doomed Henry was not military failure, but his apparent inability to learn from defeat or adapt his policies to changing circumstances. The mental breakdown that afflicted Henry in the 1450s provided his enemies with the perfect opportunity to challenge Lancastrian rule while maintaining the fiction of loyalty to the crown. The king's condition, described by contemporary sources in terms that suggest severe depression, or perhaps catatonia, created a power vacuum that could only be filled by a regent acting in his name. When Richard, Duke of York, assumed this role, he gained access to the machinery of royal government that he would eventually use to advance his own dynastic claims. Henry's recovery from his mental illness might have stabilized the political situation if he had demonstrated the kind of decisive leadership that the crisis required. Instead, his return to active rule was marked by the same indecisiveness and reliance on unpopular advisors that had characterized his earlier reign. The resumption of royal authority from York created a zero-sum conflict in which one party or the other had to be completely eliminated to prevent future challenges. The first deposition of Henry VI in 1461, following the Yorkist victory at Towton, established Edward IV as king while transforming Henry into a fugitive within his own realm. The 9 years of exile and captivity that followed demonstrated both Henry's resilience and his political irrelevance. Despite several attempts to restore him to power, he proved incapable of inspiring the kind of sustained loyalty that successful rebellions require. His readaptation in 1470, achieved through a temporary alliance between the Earl of Warwick and the French court, lasted barely 6 months before Edward IV returned to reclaim his throne. The Battle of Tewkesbury in May 1471 marked the effective end of Lancastrian hopes for restoration. The death of Prince Edward, Henry's only legitimate son, eliminated the dynasty's future while ensuring that Henry himself could no longer serve as a symbol of legitimate resistance to Yorkist rule. The capture of Queen Margaret, who had been the real driving force behind Lancastrian resistance, removed the organizational capability that had sustained the cause through years of exile and defeat. Henry's return to the Tower, following Tewkesbury, placed him in an impossible position from both personal and political perspectives. As a deposed king without an heir, he could no longer serve any useful purpose for either his supporters or his enemies. For Edward IV, Henry's continued existence represented a permanent threat to Yorkist legitimacy, a potential rallying point for future opposition that could not be safely ignored. For Henry himself, captivity meant the final acknowledgement that his life's work had ended in complete failure. The circumstances of Henry's death, on the night of May 21, 1471, reflect the careful calculation that characterizes most successful political murders. The official explanation that the former king died of melancholy upon learning of his son's death at Tewkesbury provided plausible cover for what was almost certainly deliberate elimination. The timing, occurring just hours after Edward IV's triumphant return to London, suggests coordination between the king's arrival and his predecessor's demise. Contemporary sources, written by men who served the Yorkist regime, naturally supported the official narrative, while hinting at the political necessity that made Henry's death inevitable. Later chroniclers, writing after the Tudor succession had delegitimized the Yorkist dynasty, were more willing to acknowledge the likelihood of murder, while emphasizing the divine justice that would eventually punish Henry's killers. The most persistent tradition identifies Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III, as Henry's actual killer, a narrative that conveniently fits later Tudor propaganda about Richard's villainy while serving the immediate needs of Yorkist public relations. Whether or not Richard personally administered the fatal blow, his presence in the Tower on the night of Henry's death suggests high-level involvement in whatever arrangements were made for the former king's elimination. The method by which Henry died remains a subject of historical speculation rather than documented fact. The absence of obvious wounds when his body was displayed publicly suggests either poison or suffocation, both of which would have been consistent with the need for plausible deniability about the cause of death. The gentle nature attributed to Henry's personality made it plausible that grief or despair could have caused his demise, providing cover for more direct forms of intervention. The immediate political consequences of Henry's death were exactly what Edward IV's government had intended. The elimination of the Lancastrian claimant removed the focus for potential rebellions, while allowing the Yorkist regime to present itself as the legitimate heir to English royal tradition. The speed with which opposition to Edward's rule collapsed following Henry's death demonstrated the extent to which Lancastrian resistance had depended on symbolic rather than practical considerations. Yet the longer-term implications of Henry's murder proved more complex than his killers had anticipated. The manner of his death, occurring in royal custody while under the protection of sacred kingship, challenged fundamental assumptions about the inviolability of royal persons. Even unsuccessful kings, the precedent suggested, could be eliminated when political convenience required it, a lesson that would ultimately prove dangerous to the dynasty that had established it. The posthumous reputation that developed around Henry VI reflected the particular sympathy that English political culture extended to rulers who failed through virtue rather than vice. Unlike kings who were remembered for their cruelty or incompetence, Henry came to be seen as a martyr to the brutal necessities of political life, someone whose gentle nature had made him unsuitable for kingship, but admirable as a human being. The cult of veneration that emerged around Henry's memory, including reports of miracles at his tomb, demonstrated the popular appeal of a ruler who had represented traditional Christian values in an age of increasing political cynicism. Attempts to secure his canonization as a saint reflected the widespread belief that his death had been both unjust and politically motivated, while his reputation for personal holiness provided a stark contrast to the calculated brutality of his successors. The Tower chambers where Henry spent his final hours became associated with the vulnerability that lay beneath royal grandeur. The fortress that had been built to protect English kings had become the place where they could be eliminated with impunity, where the sanctity of royal blood proved inadequate protection against political necessity. The irony was particularly acute in Henry's case, since his own gentle nature had made him the least threatening of England's medieval monarchs. The transformation of Henry's memory through subsequent historical treatment reflected changing attitudes toward the relationship between personal virtue and political effectiveness. Tudor historians, seeking to legitimize their own dynasty's seizure of power, found in Henry's story a cautionary tale about the dangers of weak kingship that justified stronger royal authority. Modern historians have been more sympathetic to his attempts to rule according to Christian principles, in an age when such behavior was seen as weakness rather than virtue. In death, Henry VI achieved a form of moral victory that had eluded him in life. The manner of his elimination, occurring under circumstances that made royal authority complicit in regicide, challenged the fundamental legitimacy of the system that had destroyed him. His posthumous reputation as a martyred saint provided a permanent rebuke to the brutal pragmatism that had made his murder seem politically necessary. The quiet violence that ended Henry's life in the Tower reflected the fundamental tension between the sacred and secular aspects of medieval kingship. While royal persons were theoretically protected by divine sanction, practical politics sometimes required the elimination of inconvenient claimants to ensure dynastic stability. Henry's death demonstrated that even the most legitimate kings remained vulnerable when their continued existence threatened the interests of more ruthless rivals. The darkness that settled over the Tower on the night of Henry's death seemed to herald a new phase in English political development, one in which traditional constraints on royal behavior would prove inadequate to prevent the kind of systematic violence that would characterize the remainder of the 15th century. The gentle king who died in these chambers had become the first casualty of a new understanding of political necessity that would ultimately consume the dynasty that had destroyed him. Richard III. The mist rises from the marshy ground around Bosworth Field like the breath of the earth itself, obscuring the low hills that ring this unremarkable patch of Leicestershire countryside and transforming the dawn landscape into something ethereal and otherworldly. The churned mud beneath the feet of thousands of men speaks to the violent business that has brought them here on this August morning in 1485, when the future of England will be decided not through parliamentary debate or dynastic negotiation, but through the ancient arbitrament of battle that has determined royal succession since the days of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, sits his destrier at the center of a deployment that represents both the culmination of medieval military science and the final assertion of a royal house that has ruled England for more than 3 centuries. At 32, he has been king for barely 2 years, yet those years have been marked by controversies and accusations that have undermined the very legitimacy he fought to establish. The man who gained the throne through claims of defending the realm against usurpation now faces a challenger whose own dynastic credentials are so tenuous that they would have been laughable in any previous generation. The path that brought Richard to this field began with the death of his brother Edward IV in April 1483, an event that should have marked the peaceful transfer of power from one generation of the York dynasty to the next. Instead, it triggered a constitutional crisis that revealed the fundamental instability underlying even apparently successful monarchies. The boy king Edward V, at 12 years old, was too young to rule independently, while the political factions that had supported his father were already fragmenting into competing interests that could not agree on the structure of a regency government. Richard's initial role as Lord Protector appeared to offer a solution that would preserve both royal authority and political stability. As the dead king's brother and an experienced military commander with his own power base in northern England, he possessed both the legitimacy and the capability that effective regency required. His early actions suggested a commitment to continuity rather than revolution, maintaining his brother's policies, confirming existing appointments, and preparing for the young king's coronation with appropriate ceremony. Yet within months of assuming the protectorship, Richard had transformed himself from guardian of his nephew's interests into usurper of his nephew's throne. The speed and efficiency of this transition suggests planning that began before Edward IV's death, though the documentary evidence that might prove premeditation was naturally destroyed by the participants. What remains clear is that Richard's seizure of power represented a calculated response to political threats that he believed endangered both his own survival and the stability of the realm. The legitimacy crisis that justified Richard's usurpation centered on claims about the validity of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, allegations that would have rendered their children illegitimate and therefore ineligible for royal succession. These charges, promoted by Bishop Stillington and endorsed by Parliament in the Act of Titulus Regius, provided the legal framework for Richard's assumption of the crown, while maintaining the fiction that he was defending rather than overthrowing legitimate authority. Modern historians have struggled to evaluate these legitimacy claims, partly because the evidence was systematically destroyed after Richard's death, and partly because medieval marriage law was sufficiently complex to accommodate multiple interpretations of the same facts. What seems most likely is that the allegations contained enough plausible detail to convince contemporaries who wanted to be convinced, while remaining sufficiently doubtful to satisfy those who preferred Richard's rule to the alternatives. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower, Edward V, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, created the most enduring mystery of Richard's reign, while providing his enemies with their most effective propaganda weapon. Whether the boys died through natural causes, deliberate murder, or simple neglect, their absence from public view after the summer of 1483 suggested to contemporaries that Richard had eliminated potential rivals in the most direct way possible. The uncertainty surrounding the prince's fate reflects the broader problem of evaluating Richard's character and motivations through sources that were written primarily by his enemies. Tudor historians, seeking to legitimize their own dynasty's seizure of power, had every incentive to portray Richard as a monster whose elimination had been both necessary and divinely ordained. The image of the hunchbacked tyrant who murdered children and usurped his brother's throne served immediate political needs while providing compelling material for literary treatment. Yet Richard's actual policies as king suggest a more complex figure than Tudor propaganda allowed. His legal reforms, including the introduction of bail for accused felons and the encouragement of trade through commercial legislation, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of governmental administration. His efforts to extend royal authority into regions that had previously enjoyed semi-autonomous status reflected ambitious plans for centralizing English government along lines that would not be fully realized until the Tudor period. The rebellion that erupted in the autumn of 1483, led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, revealed both the strength and the weakness of Richard's position. His ability to suppress the uprising through rapid military response demonstrated the effectiveness of his northern power base and the loyalty of men who had served him for years. Yet the willingness of such a prominent supporter to risk everything in rebellion suggested that Richard's legitimacy remained fundamentally questionable even among those who had initially accepted his rule. The involvement of Henry Tudor in Buckingham's rebellion marked the emergence of an alternative claimant whose dynastic credentials were so weak that they would have been dismissed in normal circumstances. Henry's claim to the throne rested on his descent from John of Gaunt, through the legitimized but specifically excluded Beaufort line, a connection so tenuous that it would never have been taken seriously without the political vacuum created by Richard's usurpation and the disappearance of more obvious heirs. Yet Henry's very weakness as a claimant paradoxically became a source of strength in building the coalition that would eventually destroy Richard. Unlike previous pretenders who represented specific factional interests, Henry could present himself as a neutral alternative to the destructive cycle of dynastic warfare that had plagued England for decades. His promise to marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, offered the possibility of uniting the competing claims of Lancaster and York in ways that could end rather than continue the civil wars. The 2 years between Buckingham's rebellion and the Battle of Bosworth were marked by Richard's increasingly desperate attempts to shore up support that was slowly but steadily eroding. His extensive use of propaganda, including the distribution of proclamations that denounced Henry Tudor as a puppet of French interests, demonstrated both his understanding of public opinion and his awareness that traditional sources of royal authority were proving inadequate to his situation. The international dimension of the developing conflict reflected the broader European context that shaped English politics throughout the 15th century. Richard's support for Burgundian interests against French expansion had created enemies who were willing to back any challenger to his authority, while his domestic opponents had natural allies among foreign powers who would benefit from English political instability. The invasion that brought Henry Tudor to Bosworth began not with massive military preparation, but with careful political calculation about the timing and location that would maximize the chances of success. Henry's small force of French mercenaries and English exiles could never have defeated Richard's larger army in a straightforward military confrontation, but they could serve as the catalyst for defections that would tip the balance in a civil conflict where political loyalty was often more important than numerical advantage. The battle itself unfolded with the kind of dramatic irony that has made it irresistible to historians and storytellers ever since. Richard's decision to lead a personal charge against Henry's position represented both tactical desperation and the kind of heroic gesture that medieval military culture demanded from kings in extremis. The sight of the crowned king fighting in the front ranks would have been intended to inspire his followers while demonstrating his personal commitment to victory or death. Yet this same gesture of royal courage created the opportunity for the betrayal that would determine the battle's outcome. The failure of key supporters like the Earl of Northumberland to engage effectively, whether through treachery or tactical confusion, left Richard's charge isolated and vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that could overwhelm even the most determined resistance. The manner of Richard's death, revealed centuries later through archaeological examination of his remains, tells a story of violence that was both personal and political. The wounds to his skull suggest multiple attackers using different weapons, warhammers, halberds, and daggers, in a frenzied assault that went far beyond what military necessity required. This was not simply the killing of an enemy commander, but the systematic destruction of a man who had come to represent everything his opponents found objectionable about royal authority. The discovery of Richard's body in a Leicester car park in 2012 provided unprecedented opportunities to examine the physical evidence of his death, while raising new questions about the historical narratives that had surrounded his reign. The skeletal remains confirmed the violent nature of his death, while challenging some aspects of the Tudor propaganda that had shaped his posthumous reputation. The absence of obvious deformity contradicted claims about his physical appearance, while the care taken in his initial burial suggested that even his enemies recognized his royal status. The immediate aftermath of Bosworth demonstrated the speed with which dynastic change could be accomplished when the right combination of military victory and political calculation came together. Henry Tudor's transformation from obscure exile to Henry VII occurred within hours of Richard's death, as supporters rushed to acknowledge the new regime while distancing themselves from the old. The crown that had been lost in the mud of Bosworth Field was retrieved and placed on Henry's head in a ceremony that combined traditional forms of royal recognition with the practical need to establish immediate legitimacy. The long process of reshaping Richard's memory began, even before his body was cold, as Tudor historians and propagandists worked to create a narrative that would justify the new dynasty's seizure of power, while delegitimizing any potential challenges to Henry VII's authority. The transformation of Richard from medieval king into literary villain reached its culmination in Shakespeare's great tragedy, which captured something essential about the corrupting nature of political ambition while sacrificing historical accuracy to dramatic effectiveness. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Richard's story is the way archaeological discovery has allowed modern scholars to revisit fundamental questions about his character and reign that had seemed settled by centuries of hostile commentary. The careful excavation of his remains, the sophisticated analysis of his wounds, and the respectful reburial that followed his identification have demonstrated that even the most thoroughly demonized historical figures retain the capacity to surprise and challenge our assumptions. The muddy field where Richard fell became a symbol of the unpredictable nature of political fortune and the ultimate vulnerability of royal authority. The last Plantagenet king died as medieval monarchy itself was dying, violently, desperately, in circumstances that mixed personal courage with political miscalculation in ways that have made his story irresistible to subsequent generations. In death, Richard achieved a form of posthumous vindication that would have been impossible in life. The archaeological recovery of his remains provided tangible evidence of his humanity while challenging the caricature that had served Tudor political needs for centuries. The man who died in the mud of Bosworth Field has been restored to historical consideration as a complex figure, whose short reign reflected both the possibilities and the limitations of royal authority in an age of transition. Louis II of Hungary. The evening marshland exhales a mist that seems to carry within it the ghosts of the day's slaughter, rising from water and mud that have been stained with the blood of what was, until this morning, one of the proudest armies in Christendom. Somewhere in this treacherous landscape of pools and reeds lies the crown of Hungary, lost along with the man who wore it and the kingdom he was meant to defend. The Battle of Mohacs is over, and with it has ended not merely one king's life but an entire era of European history. The moment when the Ottoman tide that has been rising for generations finally overwhelmed the last great barrier between the Islamic world and the heart of Christian Europe. This is August 29, 1526, and the young man who struggles through this marsh, his royal armor now a burden rather than protection, represents the tragic inadequacy of medieval Christian kingship when confronted with the military revolution that has transformed warfare throughout the early 16th century. Louis II of Hungary is 20 years old, crowned since infancy, trained in the elaborate ceremonies of royal court life, but utterly unprepared for the brutal realities of commanding armies against enemies who have perfected new forms of organized violence that render traditional knightly valor not merely useless, but actively dangerous. The path to this disaster began long before Louis inherited his troubled crowns, rooted in the systemic problems that had plagued the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia for generations. The union of these realms under the Jagiellonian dynasty had created an impressive territorial bloc that stretched from the Baltic to the Adriatic, but it had also combined their individual weaknesses in ways that made effective governance nearly impossible. Religious divisions between Catholic and Orthodox populations, linguistic barriers that prevented administrative unity, and noble privileges that limited royal authority had created a political structure that was imposing in theory but fragile in practice. The Ottoman threat that would ultimately destroy this ramshackle kingdom had been building for more than a century, as successive sultans extended their control over the Balkans through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic manipulation that systematically isolated and absorbed Christian strongholds. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 had marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, but it had also freed Ottoman resources for expansion into Central Europe along the traditional invasion routes that had carried Roman legions and barbarian warbands between the Mediterranean and the northern plains. Suleiman the Magnificent, who ascended the Ottoman throne in 1520, represented the culmination of this expansionist tradition combined with innovations in military technology and organization that made his armies the most formidable force in the contemporary world. The Janissary Corps that formed the core of his infantry had perfected the use of firearms in ways that European armies were still struggling to understand, while his artillery train included siege guns capable of reducing the strongest medieval fortifications to rubble within days rather than months. Louis's response to this mounting threat revealed both the personal courage that made him an admirable individual and the strategic blindness that made him a catastrophic king. Rather than acknowledging the military realities that required either massive foreign assistance or accommodation with Ottoman power, he chose to stake everything on a single battle that would demonstrate either divine favor for the Christian cause or the futility of further resistance. The army that Louis assembled for this decisive confrontation represented the largest military effort that Hungary had mounted in generations, drawing upon feudal levies from throughout the kingdom while incorporating foreign mercenaries whose professional expertise was meant to complement native enthusiasm. Yet, for all its impressive appearance, this force remained fundamentally medieval in organization and tactics, dependent upon heavy cavalry charges and individual combat skills that had become obsolete in an age of disciplined infantry formations and concentrated firepower. The Battle of Mohacs itself unfolded with a speed and decisiveness that shocked even participants who had understood the disparity between the opposing forces. Louis's initial assault achieved some tactical success against the Ottoman forward positions, creating a momentary impression that traditional Christian military virtues might yet prove superior to Islamic innovations. But when Suleiman committed his main force to the engagement, the Hungarian army disintegrated with a completeness that suggested not merely tactical defeat but systemic collapse. The rout that followed this brief engagement transformed an orderly retreat into chaotic flight, as individual units abandoned their positions and fled toward whatever safety the familiar landscape might offer. Louis himself, despite his youth and inexperience, attempted to maintain some semblance of command structure during the initial phases of the withdrawal, but the speed of the Ottoman pursuit made organized resistance impossible. The march that would claim the young king's life represented one of those geographic features that medieval armies had always found treacherous, but that early modern warfare made deadly. The heavy armor that had once provided protection in hand-to-hand combat became a fatal burden when combined with uncertain footing and the panic that drives men to take risks they would normally avoid. Whether Louis died through drowning, exhaustion, or injury sustained during his flight, the marsh claimed him as surely as Ottoman sabers had claimed his army. The immediate discovery of the royal corpse provided Suleiman with both a propaganda victory and a practical solution to the problem of what to do with conquered Hungarian territories. The death of the last independent Hungarian king eliminated any focal point for future resistance, while allowing the Ottomans to present themselves as bringing order to a realm that had collapsed under the weight of its own inadequacies. Yet the broader implications of Louis's death extended far beyond Hungarian borders, as European powers struggled to comprehend the strategic implications of Ottoman control over the Middle Danube basin. The Habsburg claim to Hungarian succession, based on dynastic marriages negotiated during Louis's lifetime, provided the legal framework for what would become centuries of conflict over Central European territories, while the reality of Ottoman occupation created a new frontier between Christian and Islamic civilization that would shape European development for generations. The speed with which Hungarian resistance collapsed following Mohacs revealed the extent to which the kingdom's apparent strength had been illusory, dependent upon personal loyalties and feudal obligations that could not survive the shock of comprehensive military defeat. Noble families that had supported Louis while victory seemed possible quickly calculated their interests under Ottoman rule, while peasant populations that had borne the burden of royal taxation found little reason to mourn the disappearance of a government that had provided neither protection nor prosperity. The transformation of Mohacs into a symbol of Christian defeat and Ottoman triumph reflected the broader European struggle to understand the implications of a battle that had redrawn the political map of Central Europe in a single afternoon. Contemporary chroniclers, working within intellectual frameworks that assumed the ultimate triumph of Christian civilization, found it difficult to explain how divine providence could have permitted such a comprehensive victory for Islamic arms. The memory of Louis's death in the marshes became woven into Hungarian national consciousness as both tragedy and warning, a reminder of the price of political division and military unpreparedness when confronted with existential threats. Later generations would invoke Mohacs as a symbol of the vulnerability that results from internal weakness, while the image of the young king drowning in familiar waters provided a powerful metaphor for the way external pressures could overwhelm domestic institutions. The environmental dimension of Louis's death, the way terrain that should have provided refuge instead became a trap, reflected broader changes in the nature of warfare that made traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Medieval armies had always understood the importance of choosing favorable ground for battle, but early modern conflicts required new forms of mobility and logistics that could turn any landscape into either advantage or liability. depending on the circumstances of engagement. The Ottoman treatment of Louis' remains, conducted with the respect that Islamic military tradition accorded to fallen enemies, demonstrated the sophisticated political understanding that characterized Suleiman's approach to conquest. By honoring the dead Hungarian king while absorbing his territories, the Ottomans positioned themselves as legitimate successors to Hungarian authority rather than foreign occupiers, a distinction that would prove crucial for maintaining control over ethnically diverse populations. The dynastic crisis that followed Louis's death revealed the extent to which 16th-century European politics remained dependent upon personal relationships and inherited claims that could be disrupted by a single battle's outcome. The Habsburg assertion of rights to Hungarian succession created the legal framework for centuries of conflict, while the practical reality of Ottoman occupation ensured that these claims would be contested through warfare rather than negotiation. In death, Louis II achieved a tragic significance that had eluded him in life, becoming a symbol of the transition between medieval and early modern Europe that was marked by the collision between traditional Christian kingship and Islamic imperial expansion. His drowning in the marshes of Mohacs represented not merely personal tragedy but civilizational shift, the moment when European assumptions about the inevitability of Christian triumph encountered the reality of Ottoman military superiority. The waters that claimed the young king became a boundary between two ages, marking the end of an era when Hungarian independence had seemed natural and the beginning of a new period when Central European territories would be contested between competing empires whose resources and ambitions dwarfed anything the Pals, medieval kingdoms had been able to mobilize. The crown that sank beneath the surface of that marsh carried with it not just one man's hopes, but an entire political order that had proven inadequate to the challenges of a changing world. King Charles I. The scaffold erected in the crisp January air outside Whitehall bears witness to an event so unprecedented in European history that even its organizers seem uncertain about the protocols that should govern the judicial murder of a dumber king. Frost covers the wooden planks where Charles Stuart will meet his death, while the crowd that has gathered to witness this extraordinary spectacle murmurs with the particular tension that accompanies moments when the normal order of things is about to be irrevocably altered. This is January 30, 1649, and the man who will die here represents not merely one individual's political failure, but the collapse of an entire theory of government that has shaped European civilization for more than a millennium. Charles I stands at the center of a constitutional crisis that has torn England apart for the better part of a decade, a conflict that began with disputes over taxation and religious policy, but has evolved into something far more fundamental, a challenge to the very idea that kings rule by divine appointment and remain accountable only to God for their actions. The civil wars that brought him to this scaffold have been fought not merely over specific policies, but over competing visions of political authority that cannot be reconciled through compromise or accommodation. The path to this moment began with Charles's attempt to govern without parliament, a policy that reflected both his sincere belief in the divine nature of royal authority and his practical inability to manage the financial and administrative challenges that required parliamentary cooperation. The 11 years of personal rule from 1629 to 1640 had demonstrated that early modern government could not function effectively without the consent of the governing classes, while Charles's religious policies had alienated precisely those Protestant constituencies whose support any English monarch needed to maintain domestic stability. The Scottish crisis that forced Charles to recall Parliament in 1640 revealed the extent to which his attempt at absolute rule had weakened rather than strengthened royal authority. The National Covenant that united Scottish resistance to his religious innovations represented not merely opposition to specific policies, but rejection of the entire model of top-down religious uniformity that characterized early, modern monarchical government. When military force proved inadequate to suppress Scottish resistance, Charles found himself dependent upon parliamentary financing for any effective response to the crisis. The Long Parliament, that assembled in November 1640, brought together men whose decade of exclusion from government had convinced them that royal authority required fundamental constitutional restraints to prevent future abuses. The legislation they enacted during the first 2 years of their session, abolishing prerogative courts, requiring parliamentary consent for taxation, mandating regular parliamentary sessions, represented a systematic effort to transform English government from royal autocracy into constitutional monarchy. Yet Charles's response to these constitutional innovations revealed the psychological impossibility of accepting limitations that he believed violated the sacred nature of kingship itself. His attempt to arrest 5 members of Parliament in January 1642 demonstrated both his continued faith in the effectiveness of personal royal action and his complete misunderstanding of the political forces that parliamentary opposition represented. When this gesture failed to intimidate his opponents, it instead provided them with the justification they needed to begin preparing for armed resistance. The civil wars that followed were characterized by a complexity that defied simple categorization as conflicts between royalists and parliamentarians. Regional loyalties, religious affiliations, economic interests, and personal relationships created patterns of allegiance that shifted throughout the conflict. While both sides struggled to develop military and administrative capabilities adequate to sustain prolonged warfare, Charles's initial advantages in terms of traditional noble support and military experience were gradually eroded by Parliament's superior resources and more effective alliance with Scottish forces. The King's capture in 1647 created a novel situation for which neither side had adequate precedents or clear policies. As a prisoner who retained his theoretical dignity as an anointed monarch, Charles occupied an ambiguous status that complicated all subsequent negotiations. His continued attempts to regain power through alliances with Scottish forces and foreign intervention demonstrated both his refusal to accept defeat and his inability to recognize that the political landscape had been permanently altered by the wars he had helped to precipitate. The decision to put Charles on trial for treason against his own subjects represented a revolutionary innovation in European political thought, the practical implementation of ideas about popular sovereignty that had previously existed only in theoretical treatises. The High Court of Justice that assembled to hear charges against the king included men who understood the historical significance of their proceedings while remaining uncertain about the legal and theological implications of judging an anointed monarch. The charges against Charles, read aloud in Westminster Hall before a carefully selected audience, provided a comprehensive indictment of personal rule that drew upon both English constitutional tradition and newer theories about the contractual nature of political authority. The king was accused of breaking his coronation oath, waging war against his own subjects, and placing his personal will above the common good of the realm, charges that implied a fundamental redefinition of the relationship between rulers and ruled. Charles's response to these proceedings revealed both the dignity that had characterized the best aspects of his kingship and the inflexibility that had made his political downfall inevitable. His refusal to recognize the court's authority maintained the principle of divine right monarchy, while ensuring that the trial would become a public demonstration of the incompatibility between traditional royal prerogatives. Emerging ideas about political accountability. The execution itself was carefully choreographed to demonstrate both the solemnity of the proceedings and the irreversible nature of the constitutional change they represented. Charles's behavior on the scaffold, his careful attention to his appearance, his final speech defending his actions, his composed acceptance of death, provided a masterful performance of royal dignity under impossible circumstances that would influence European attitudes toward monarchy for generations. The technical aspects of the execution were handled with the kind of professional competence that characterized English administrative efficiency at its best. The axe fell cleanly, the crowd's reaction was carefully managed, and the king's remains were quickly secured to prevent the kind of relic gathering that had complicated other politically significant deaths. Yet these practical arrangements could not disguise the unprecedented nature of what had occurred, or its implications for the future of European monarchical government. The immediate aftermath of Charles's execution revealed both the domestic and international complications that regicide created for the new Republican government. English reaction ranged from genuine horror among traditional royalists to enthusiastic approval among radical Protestants who saw the king's death as divine judgment on tyrannical rule. European courts responded with predictable outrage and diplomatic isolation, while Catholic propagandists found in Charles's martyrdom perfect material for attacking Protestant claims to moral superiority. The transformation of Charles's memory began even before his execution, as both supporters and opponents worked to shape the narrative that would surround his death. Royalist writers emphasized his dignity in death and his commitment to traditional constitutional principles, while Republican apologists stressed the necessity of his elimination for English liberty and Protestant religion. The king who had failed to govern effectively became, in death, a more powerful symbol than he had ever been in life. The publication of Icon Basilique, allegedly Charles's own account of his spiritual and political struggles, provided the literary framework for royalist martyrology, while demonstrating the continued appeal of monarchical ideals, even after their practical failure. The book's enormous popularity throughout Europe suggested that traditional attitudes toward kingship retained significant emotional and intellectual power, despite the evident inadequacies of divine right theory when confronted with political reality. The long-term constitutional implications of Charles's execution extended far beyond immediate questions of government organization to fundamental issues about the nature of political authority and popular sovereignty. The precedent established in 1649 that kings could be held legally accountable for their actions and removed when found wanting provided theoretical justification for future limitations on royal power while demonstrating the practical possibility of republican government in a European context. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of Charles's death was the way it revealed the psychological and cultural investment that European civilization had made in monarchical government. The shock that greeted news of the execution throughout Europe reflected not merely political calculation, but genuine bewilderment about how Christian society could function without the organizing principle of sacred kingship that had structured political relationships for centuries. The scaffold at Whitehall became a symbol of the revolutionary potential that lay dormant within apparently stable political systems, the possibility that even the most traditional forms of authority could be challenged and overthrown when they proved inadequate to contemporary needs. The king who died there had become, through the manner of his death, both martyr to an old order and inadvertent midwife to a new one. The frost that covered the execution platform on that January morning seemed to mirror the chill that Charles's death sent through European courts, where monarchs suddenly found themselves contemplating the possibility that divine right might prove inadequate protection against popular resistance. The blood that stained the scaffold at Whitehall carried within it the seeds of constitutional innovations that would ultimately transform the nature of European government, making Charles's execution not merely the end of one king's life, but the beginning of a new era in the relationship between rulers and ruled. Louis XVI. The grey winter light that filters through the windows of the Temple prison carries with it the particular melancholy that comes when personal tragedy intersects with historical inevitability. illuminating a scene that represents both individual suffering and the collapse of an entire social order. In the distance, the sounds of Paris preparing for spectacle drift through walls that were built to house medieval knights, but now confine a king whose crown has become not a symbol of divine authority, but evidence of social oppression that an aroused people will no longer tolerate. This is January 21, 1793, and Louis XVI, who began his reign 18 years earlier as the most Christian king of France and Navarre, now awaits execution as citizen Louis Capet, condemned by a revolutionary tribunal that has transformed regicide from unthinkable sacrilege into patriotic duty. The man who once claimed to rule by grace of God will die by decision of a national convention that derives its authority from popular sovereignty, a political inversion so complete that it challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of government and social order that have shaped European civilization for more than a millennium. The revolution that brought Louis to this extremity began not with radical ideology, but with the kind of fiscal crisis that had plagued the Bourbon monarchy for generations. The accumulated debt of European wars and domestic extravagance that no amount of traditional taxation could resolve without fundamental reforms that the privileged classes were determined to resist. Louis's attempts to address these financial problems through ministerial changes and administrative innovations had only revealed the extent to which the absolute monarchy's apparent power depended upon the consent of precisely those social groups whose privileges required reformation. The calling of the Estates General in May 1789, the first such assembly since 1614, had been intended as a temporary expedient to legitimize necessary fiscal reforms while maintaining the essential structure of monarchical government. Instead, it became the catalyst for a political transformation that swept away not merely the Bourbon dynasty, but the entire social hierarchy that had sustained traditional French civilization. The Third Estate's transformation into a national assembly claiming sovereign authority represented a revolution in political theory as well as practice. Louis's response to these early revolutionary innovations revealed both the personal decency that made him an admirable individual and the political indecisiveness that made him a catastrophic king. His apparent acceptance of constitutional limitations during the early phases of the revolution reflected genuine commitment to reform, combined with a failure to understand that constitutional monarchy required not merely royal acquiescence, but active royal leadership in adapting traditional institutions to contemporary demands. The flight to Varennes in June 1791 marked the decisive turning point in Louis's relationship with revolutionary France, the moment when his previous cooperation with constitutional change was reinterpreted as strategic deception rather than sincere conversion to limited monarchy. The royal family's attempted escape provided concrete evidence of the king's opposition to revolutionary principles while demonstrating his willingness to seek foreign intervention against his own subjects. The war that began in April 1792 created the political context that would ultimately cost Louis his life, transforming domestic constitutional conflict into international ideological struggle that made accommodation between revolutionary and traditional principles impossible. Louis's position as commander-in-chief of French forces fighting against European monarchies defending traditional royal prerogatives created an impossible conflict of loyalties that could only be resolved through his elimination as a political factor. The August 10 insurrection that overthrew the constitutional monarchy represented the triumph of popular radicalism over bourgeois moderation, the moment when the revolution moved beyond institutional reform towards social transformation that required the destruction rather than reformation of traditional authority. Louis's imprisonment in the Temple following this popular uprising marked his transformation from constitutional monarch into enemy of the people whose very existence threatened revolutionary principles. The discovery of the royal correspondence that provided evidence of Louis's communication with foreign enemies gave the National Convention the legal pretext it needed to proceed with trial and execution while maintaining the fiction that revolutionary justice, rather than political necessity, determined the king's fate. The armoire de feu that yielded these incriminating documents became a symbol of royal duplicity that justified the most extreme measures against traditional authority. The trial itself was less a judicial proceeding than a political demonstration designed to educate the French people about the incompatibility between monarchy and popular sovereignty, while providing legal sanction for what was essentially a revolutionary act. The charges against Louis, conspiracy against the liberty of the nation, and attacks on the general security of the state, represented a fundamental redefinition of treason that made royal authority itself criminal rather than sacred. Louis's defense, conducted with dignity that impressed even his political enemies, emphasized his acceptance of constitutional limitations and his attempts to work within the revolutionary framework rather than against it. Yet this very moderation, which might have saved him under different circumstances, served revolutionary purposes by demonstrating the impossibility of reforming rather than destroying monarchical government. The vote that condemned Louis to death revealed the extent to which revolutionary logic had overcome traditional scruples about regicide among men who had begun the revolution with no intention of challenging monarchical government itself. The narrow margin by which execution was approved, 361 votes against 360, suggested that even convinced revolutionaries recognized the unprecedented nature of what they were undertaking. The final weeks between condemnation and execution were marked by Louis's transformation from political prisoner into Christian martyr, a role that provided him with the spiritual framework he needed to face death with dignity, while creating the symbolic foundation for future royalist resistance. His reconciliation with the Catholic Church, his forgiveness of his enemies, and his acceptance of death as divine will provided a template for royal martyrdom that would influence European political culture for generations. The execution itself was carefully designed to demonstrate both the people's justice and the irreversible nature of the revolutionary transformation it represented. The guillotine, that technological innovation that made death swift and egalitarian, ensured that Louis would die like any other criminal, rather than with the ceremonial complexity that had traditionally surrounded royal death. The machine that severed his head became a symbol of revolutionary equality that reduced kings to the same mortality as their humblest subjects. The crowd that gathered in the Place de la Révolution to witness the execution represented a cross-section of Parisian society, united in their commitment to revolutionary principles, if not in their understanding of what those principles required. The drumming that drowned out Louis's final words ensured that his death would be remembered as popular triumph rather than royal martyrdom, while the speed of the execution prevented any dramatic gestures that might have complicated the political narrative. The immediate aftermath of the regicide revealed both the domestic and international consequences that the convention had accepted in choosing to execute rather than merely depose their king. The European coalition that formed to combat revolutionary France represented not merely traditional power politics, but genuine horror at the violation of sacred principles that Louis's death represented. While domestic reaction ranged from Republican enthusiasm to royalist outrage that would fuel civil war for years to come, the transformation of Louis's memory began immediately as competing political factions worked to shape the narrative that would surround his death. Revolutionary propaganda emphasized the necessity of eliminating royal tyranny for popular liberty, while royalist martyrology stressed his personal virtue and the injustice of his treatment by ungrateful subjects. The king who had failed to provide effective leadership in life became, through the manner of his death, a more powerful political symbol than he had ever been while alive. The technological innovation that made Louis's execution possible, the guillotine's mechanical precision and egalitarian efficiency, represented broader changes in the nature of state power that the revolution had unleashed. The machine that killed the king embodied revolutionary principles of equality before the law, while demonstrating the rationalized violence that modern states could deploy against their enemies. The international reaction to Louis's execution established precedents for ideological warfare that would influence European politics for more than a century, creating alignments based on principles rather than interests, while making accommodation between revolutionary and traditional states increasingly difficult. The regicide that had been intended to secure French revolutionary achievements instead ensured their international isolation and military confrontation. In death, Louis XVI achieved a significance that had eluded him in life, becoming simultaneously the last martyr of divine right monarchy and the first victim of popular sovereignty taken to its logical extreme. His execution marked not merely the end of one dynasty, but the beginning of a new era in which political authority would derive from popular will rather than traditional legitimacy, a transformation that would reshape European civilization in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. The blood that stained the scaffold in the Place de la Révolution carried within it both the end of the old world and the beginning of the new, marking the moment when European politics moved beyond traditional frameworks toward the ideological conflicts that would characterize the modern era. The king who died there had become, through his death, both symbol of what had been lost and catalyst for what was yet to come.